Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Geopolitics with Tyberius D. And today it's going to be a highly viewer-requested episode, which we basically hinted at with the last one. We're going to talk about World War II, the biggest armed military geopolitical confrontation the world has ever seen. Roll the intro. Okay, so a lot of people get a little confused when I talk about this particular topic, or especially compared to the Cold War. The Cold War is the biggest geopolitical standoff in all of world history. The World War II is the biggest geopolitical confrontation in world history that was a knockdown, drag-out fight between the combatants. And there is a major difference because while you have the Americans and the Soviets during the Cold War at each other's throats, is that it is not a knockdown, drag-out fight in the regards that, there will be bullets and tomahawk missiles thrown at each other's way, but it will never be a direct confrontation in the regards of, hey, we're deploying tanks and armies and aircraft directly against each other in a knockdown, drag-out fight to see who can geopolitically master the outcomes of their desire. It's a knockdown, drag-out fight to force their geopolitical outcomes, right? The Cold War is a lot more subtle than this. World War II is the reason why you never have a World War III to a large degree, and that is because it is the most bloody, most destructive, most total, and it literally is a confrontation in totality. Great. It is the biggest confrontation in totality that has ever existed on the planet, and the reason why the Cold War basically never gets to World War III, besides the nuclear weapons and basically a potential Armageddon, is that no one wants to see what has happened again with World War II, and particularly even with the stat of World War I. And so the context is here. Basically, everyone thinks that if there was ever going to be a World War III, it would be World War II on crack, in the same way that World War II was World War I on crack. So let's set the stage. How does this happen? Why does it happen? And going forth. Well, I want to fast forward everyone into my episode on national mercantilism for war and trade. I'm sorry, for trade, or for wealth and trade. What largely has happened is that since the era that nation states began, where you have the kingdoms of old start forming into what we call the nation state system, where governments are there. Governments are there to largely be a representative of peoples and nationalities versus what you became before was feudalism, and that it was largely an ownership of people's claims to a duchy, a kingdom, a principality. It was people's claims to land. Nations are not like this. Nations are representative of peoples. Now, this is a lot different because just because it's representative of peoples doesn't mean those peoples have a lot of say. You will have some of these nations are incredibly autocratic and incredibly despotic. On the other side is that you'll have nations that believe in liberal democracy. It is just because the people are represented or not represented does not mean that the state and the institutions of these nations does not serve the people and their geopolitical interests. And so, I needed a drink. And so going into this, what has happened is that over the last 300 years leading into World War II, is that you have had the nation and state system rise in power and prominence, and with the rise of industrialization and the Industrial Revolution and the rise of basically the nation state system across the world, is that what you tend to have, if you will, is this ever increasing, ever greater wars of totality. that eventually culminate into the greatest crescendo of this that you could possibly imagine, and that is World War II. And so a lot of people blame World War One, and a lot of people blame the Great Depression, which set the stage, do not get me wrong. But on the other side of that, in truth and totality, is that this is the culmination of centuries of armed geopolitical confrontation every 30 years or so that has finally gotten to the point where it's basically total. And I use this word completely often enough over and over again, because when I say that World War II is total war, I mean it's total war. There is no facet of life that goes untouched. There is no economic structure that goes untouched. There is no political structure that goes untouched. It reaches out and touches the lives of every single human on the planet. And even those who will not be directly involved in the nations that basically check out in the war or do not be involved, is that they will still feel its impact. But more importantly, for those who are involved in this particular geopolitical confrontation, is that it will upend lives. It will destroy nations. It will completely reinvent the world order from when it starts to where it ends. So, we gave the bigger background. Let's set the context of this particular event. We'll go down the great powers list basically as a nutshell, because every major great power is involved in this. So let's talk about this. The only great power that you could maybe equate to is the Turks. And the Turks, going into this war, are basically shoved out of history. World War I was the end of the Ottoman Empire and the absolute collapse. The Turks are no longer really considered great power status. They are basically a dick in the wind. They do not have, they do not have any major geopolitical power and security to project power into the rest of the world like they did during the Ottoman Empire. And so, at least with where we're at here, is that the Turks are no longer invested in this kind of confrontation. They are relatively the same level of power as Sweden, a nation that has 1/10 the population that they do. So, let's hit the actual great powers plus that remains. Before that, Austria is no longer a nation after World War I, which is largely dissolved. So they were once a great power. They're completely removed. And everyone else is either remains from the great powers list or has kind of been formed out, because basically is that the great powers list went from 10 to 8 following World War I, with the collapse of the Ottomans and the collapse of the Austrian empires. What you get into this is the core 8 that we talked about during the core episode, and let's talk about where these nations are coming out of World War I and what has happened. Because let me backtrack a little bit. Before I talk about the aftermath of World War I, let's talk about what happens in 1929. In 1929, the United States, being the biggest economy in the world, and had been so for basically the past 40 years at this point, goes into the biggest economic crash it's ever had. And being the number one major power in the world, economically speaking, is that even though they are not directly invested into anyone else's imperial systems, is that they are the biggest proponents of trade in the world, and they're willing to trade with anyone and everyone who will basically give them money. And so, when the American system goes into decline and it goes into collapse, everyone else feels it in some sort of way. Some will recover far quicker than others, but some will absolutely feel it horrifically. Ironically enough, Germany is one of the ones that feels this most, even though they actually have some of the least amount of trade. And this is largely due to the fact that the German economy was still trying to get off its feet from the reparations and the destruction of World War I, and this is basically kicking the dog while it was down. And so, ironically enough, some of the powers that are out there are hurt more than others. But let's talk about this in a nutshell. Japan is the first to actually get out of the Great Depression and only lasts for a year for them. The biggest reason is that while they will be relying on trade with the Americans, is that they are on this massive industrial build-out program into investing into their own system and making them an imperial power to themselves. This has been going on now for the better part of 40 years. And basically, even though they would rely on the Americans for oil imports, is that to a large degree, the only thing they needed was that, and everything else they didn't rely on them, or they relied on somebody else for. And so, in a nutshell, the Japanese do not feel it hardly that much and will largely escape relatively unscathed within the span of a year. Next is the Russians. The Russians are basically completely, what's the word here? They're excommunicated from the Americans writ large. The Americans do not maintain diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, going at post-Russian Revolution. And I'm not going to say they were subject to embargo, but there was very little trade that could possibly happen, considering they're largely on the opposite sides of the planet, and it is a completely different economic interaction from one to the other. And so there's very little trade that's going on there as well, and Russia's having its own industrial build-out, basically during Stalin's 5-year plans to turn it into, during Stalin's 5-year plans to turn Russia from an agrarian backwater that basically still believed in feudalism come the end of World War I, to a modern nation state that is industrialized and powerful. And so they will hardly get tripped up at all. But other nations will feel this to a lot more of a degree. We talked about Germany, and the reason why Germany is that they were already kind of sputtering in and out economically as it was. And so basically when the American system comes through, or collapses, is that even though they don't have a significant amount of trade with the Americans, is that they feel it, particularly in the financial industries that are trying to burgeon out in Germany, and they largely collapse. And it will be so bad that a very pluralistic Germany in 1928 that is largely has most of its major political parties, and there's about 6 of them at this point, are all relatively within the same general level of power, is that come 1932, the Nazis will be the number one political institution in the country. It has that level of reaction. And to cement this even worse is that downturn is so bad that the second addition to that is that the communists are the second biggest political institution in Germany. And so basically all hell broke loose politically. Basically all hell breaks loose within Germany politically. And without further ado, going forward through that, is that, sorry, I'm having a little bit of a stroke here. Anyway, what largely happens is that the extreme right and the extreme left within Germany, because of the economic decline, is able to mobilize support because the institutions that people have been trying to build out over the last about 10 years, is failing, or is not seem to be effective. And so the German people are desperate, and they're looking towards drastic and hard action to get Germany back on its feet. And so either tends to the communists, or they tend to the fascists or the Nazis, to get basically right the wrongs of what is going on in Germany. So that's a massive issue. Anyway, let's go into some of the other powers. Italy is already kind of, Italy's already kind of economically in a hole. They never were really able to economically put themselves on the right track since unification back in 1860. And going forward with this is that Italy is always being underperforming economically pretty much since the day it was formed. And that even goes to this very day, is that while it's a major Western nation and actually even part of the G8, is that it's usually been one of the biggest underperformers. It's never made a mark for itself in being a major economic player within the world. It always has a very limited growth rate, always tends to have very nominal, just very normal numbers. It never really catches anyone's eye as being the next major target for investment or the next major target of growth. And so, at least in Italy economically, is that the Great Depression doesn't really faze them because they're basically in rolling recession since the foundation of their nation. So Italy, largely ignored. Getting to the other nations, though, this is where it starts going to crap. France is absolutely hit with this pretty hard. A lot of French institutions were largely saved by the Americans during World War One, not in the terms of their military or their politics, but their economic structures were largely saved by the Americans and propped up during World War One. France was getting very close to being bankrupt during World War One, and was largely under the strain of having most of its steel and manufacturing in the northern part of France being occupied by the Germans. And so, at least in a region, at least in a perspective here, is that France is already going to crap and still trying to put itself back together. And when the United States, which has been its major benefactor and beneficiary, tanks out, is that the French tank out with it. Now, the good news is for the French is that they'll be on the quicker end to recover, because while they didn't have as much, basically the conversation is that while they fell, they didn't have as far to fall as some other nations. The last nation that we'll get into regarding this is obviously Britain, and Britain really takes a hard time of this. They'll eventually escape the Great Depression by 1936 because they have their own imperial system that they can rely on, but it's a really heavy beating for the British come 1930 to dealing with the Great Depression, because a lot of the American financial institutions have carried over into Britain, particularly because of the effects of World War One. A lot of institutions owe U.S. banks a lot of money, and a lot of that is from war debts, and a lot of that is war purchases that go back into World War One, and part of it's just economic integration that we see to this very day that is still continuing. Is that the British really get hurt by it. And so they're actually on some level parallel to Germany, but at least in some regards is that they had a lot further to fall, where Germany didn't have that far. And so Britain will stay politically stable and economically relevant, but it will be a nasty kick for them. And so I think I hit everybody. We hit Japan, we hit Italy, we hit Germany, we hit France, Britain, Russia, and the United States. We're forgetting somebody. Oh, we forgot China. China has never been a major economic entity at this point. It is largely, by this point, China is actually about to start being occupied by Japan. The Manchurian invasion will be in 1931. And basically after the death of Sun Yat-sen, is that China is basically falling apart into civil war, if not warlord status. And this is largely happening all at the same time anyway. So, not majorly economically relevant anyway. Absolutely starts dying out as a geopolitical entity, politically as it was, because they were still trying to unite the thing anyway. And so, economically, they don't really feel it, but they never had anything to feel to begin with. Alright, cool. So that sets the tone with the Great Depression. And going into the 1930s, let's set the tone overall in the regards of what happened after World War I and why each nation's objectives are going into World War II, because largely World War II is World War I redux, which is unfortunate. But obviously there's a few people that kind of switch sides. It's kind of ironic. Basically what happens is that Germany stays on the same side, Italy flips sides, Japan flips sides, and everyone who was originally part of the Central Powers in the First World War is now dead. Austria and the Ottomans, right? So it's basically whoever allies with Germany is basically is taking the team to get their ass beat. So yeah, fun times that all around. Let's finish this out. So World War I happens. Wow, you're still alive after the last stream. Yes, I am. Doing very, very good. Okay. Anyway, finishing out and talking about where World War I comes to an end is that we already talked about the two major powers that had lost and were wiped off the face of the planet. And so where is the core eight still left? China is trying to put itself back together during the 1920s. Is doing a little bit okay for itself. It's got some occupied territories from the Europeans, but at least they no longer have German influence, and a lot of the Europeans are at each other's throats over who gets spheres of influence within China, and the Chinese are actually able to make a little bit of political gains out of this. And so China is actually putting itself back together. You have you have the end of the Qing Empire during World War I, or basically before World War I. and you'll largely have the formation of what is the Republic of China, and that will largely be, of course, the Kuomintang, and what will largely be what is led by Sun Yat-sen to unite China as a nationalistic entity, but will also fall apart into warlord status. And of course, Chiang Kai-shek is the guy who largely takes over from that. And it's unfortunate that China basically splinters and disintegrates in the same way that it has done so many times throughout history. So, post-World War I is that China's trying to put itself together, and at a time it will start to do pretty well, but basically once Sun Yat-sen dies, is that it's off to the races. Okay, cool. Germany, we'll talk about them. Germany's defeated in World War I, the only central power to actually survive. They basically have their monarchy ripped away from them, where it's forced to abdicate, and largely a lot of people are okay with that because the monarchy had proven that it was no longer capable of handling Germany in the sense that it should have. Of course, the problem is that with the end of the monarchy, you have no major geopolitical institution that controls Germany, and you have a makeshift government that's put in the guise of a German republic, and it has very little teeth, very little power, because number one, no one believes in it. No one tried to create it on purpose, or the German people don't really try to create this on purpose. It's not really something that's embedded into the German consciousness. And what largely ends up happening is that the country starts falling into a civil war, and the government is able to convince the what it remains the old German military to side with the government and to largely help violently put down a lot of the violent insurrections and rebellious factions within the country. And they're able to do this in a major way. Come 1922 is that most of the major uprising and rebellions throughout Germany are largely put down, and while you will see a far more militaristic radicalism within Germany, is that there is a little bit of peace and stability that does kind of arise during the Weimar Republic, but also is that if anyone gets too far out of hand, basically a bunch of unemployed soldiers are rapidly conscripted, brought into the German military to put down anyone who is getting too uppity. And so basically authoritarian democracy, ladies and gentlemen, here we are. This doesn't go well, but basically there is no major political entity that is able to Basically, there's no major political entity that is able to coalesce power within Germany to make major radical changes, because between the communists, the center left, the center, the center right, and the far right, being the Nazis, is that everyone's largely in a balance of power. And if I remember right, there's 6 major parties that are going on at this point that are all, they're all relatively balancing power between each other. Some people will make gains, some people will make a few losses, but it doesn't get to a point where any coalition government outside of the normal center is really all that possible. And so all the extremists are largely not shut out, but they're largely not able to govern. And so Germany becomes relatively normal, at least throughout most of the 1920s. It will have serious issues to the point where the French will literally invade the Rhineland come 1923, 1926, and it will make a massive dump on the German prestige. But basically, Germany's trying to hold itself together by blood, sweat, and tears, and they're able to do so, but just barely. And of course, once eventually you have the Great Depression, it's over. Maybe I should have done this Great Depression second. I apologize. Anyway, so let's talk about Italy. Italy is part of the victorious side of the Allied powers in World War I, but they're not happy with their gains. They have gained very, very little. Basically, the port of Trieste from the Austrian Empire, and a couple of islands off the coast of modern-day Croatia. This is not what they bargained for, and particularly with the massive amounts of lives and industrial resources that they've expended to defeat Austria, is that they felt like they were entitled to a lot more. Between basically being very offended post-World War I at the fellow Allied powers, and having a political revolution which brings the rise of the fascisti, otherwise known as the fascists, is that Italy effectively switched sides and becomes part of a new Central Powers, which we will later call the Axis. A lot of this ends up being the fact that Italy, if the Allied powers are not going to respect Italy's claims and sacrifices in the Great War, which being World War One, is that they'll go get a new team, and so they do. Getting the final Axis power out of the way, you have Japan. Japan was also on the Allied powers going into World War One, but they didn't have a lot to gain out of World War One, and the problem is that their major prominent ally that actually ties them to the Allies is Great Britain. Largely signed an alliance back in the late 1800s as a foil, if you will, to Russia, is that they see common interest in opposing Russian interests. However, what largely tends to happen here is that the Russians have been largely defeated by the Japanese during the Battle of the Tsushima Strait. The Japanese have shown that they are clearly the naval superiority within the region. They don't need to worry about anybody else within there, and so everything is a land battle. And the only other person that is a naval rival is, ironically, their biggest ally. And so an alliance that was already starting to look a little bit precarious going into World War I completely dissolves post-war. And the reason why is that in World War I, there was still bits to be gained out of being a part of the Allied powers, is that they don't have Britain or France or America or Russia openly imposing their interests. And so what they are able to do is that at the decline, or basically at the behest of the decline of German colonies, is that, the Japanese are able to at least leverage themselves as being a victorious Allied power to either get concessions from what would have been the former German colonies, which they get quite a bit, or being able to take part in the occupation of Tsingtao, which is the major German colony in China. And so, anyway, at least as far as everything that I can talk about regarding Japan is that every reason that they had to be part of the Allies was already slipping away during World War I, and come the end of World War I, they absolutely seem to have very little reason, if at all, to be allied to anyone. Germany and Italy have a lot of same interests in opposing Russian interests. They have a lot of same interests in opposing British interests and French interests. It just lines up for them. Lines up entirely for them. Is that basically every enemy that they both have is that one has, the other has. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing going on in terms of them putting themselves together. But of course, we don't like these people now throughout history because of all the horrible shit that they did. What I'm getting at is that it makes geopolitical sense to be on the team that they were. The problem with the Axis is they really needed at least one more player to even out the odds. Going 5v3 doesn't work very well. And I guess maybe a lot of people thought, geopolitically speaking, that 5v3 was a lot easier to handle than 7v3, contrary to the last war. And maybe there's a point to be had in there, but Italy and Japan is not much better than having Italy or Austria and the Ottomans on your team. And so, basically, the biggest fumble that in geopolitics that the Axis has is that they really should have tried to go for an even split between the great powers, and they weren't able to pull one more over to their team. And so, basically, you get World War II that is a 5v3 split. Let's talk about the Allied powers and talk about where they are, because a couple of them will be broken by World War II, which we already talked about in the Cold War. Let's talk about France. France is effectively broken as a major nation state come the end of World War I. While it is still functional and is technically a victor, is that they will gain nothing. They'll gain a little territory in Syria and Lebanon, and they'll gain prestige as to having helped defeat the German army. But let's be honest, what happens here? The Germans were taking on the French and the Russians at the same time, absolutely massacring the Russians, absolutely bodying the French at the same time. And it took the combined forces of Britain and France, and to some degree Russia, and eventually the Americans, all to keep the Germans contained and eventually defeated. France, for all of its military prowess that it has largely built up, post the Franco-Prussian War, is that it's been never able to capitalize on it, and the Germans have proven themselves economically, militarily, and politically far more cognizant and I cannot word today. Far more cognizant and far more effective as a nation than the French have. And of course, when it comes to World War One or the Great War, is that France is absolutely bodied. The major industrial parts of their country major industrial parts of their country are occupied for the better part of 4 years. Their economy is pushed to the absolute limit. There is an entire generation of French soldiers that are lost in the battlefields of Flanders and France, defending against the Germans, in which they call the Lost Generation. And this is relative to the song Flanders Fields. The Germans don't have that near as much. They'll take more casualties overall, but they were casualties that they can more afford. France couldn't. France was just not as powerful and as big and as populated as Germany was, and it will pay the price for it. And so basically, the old term of this is that France is largely bled white as a nation. They will still have a major navy. They will still have a decent competent air force, but their military or their land forces are completely drained. And for all the technological advancements that they will try to make in the post-war, is that they largely are trying to fight World War One over again and basically bleed the Germans white next time, and that's not going to work. So at least going in, is that France is politically, economically, and militarily exhausted. It needs at least 2 full generations to recoup its losses, and it needs 2 full generations to recoup its losses, build out a functional economic engine, politically reunify under a new aegis of power, and have its military basically, if you will, regain its competence. And this happens way too early for them. Of course, we'll get into that as we get into the actual events of World War II. Who else do we have? Okay, we need to do... we already talked about China. Okay, I don't need to talk about them more, so I'll scratch them off the list. The United Kingdom is largely not bled white, but is pushed to the limit. What World War I largely shows with the British Empire is that the British Empire was always having was largely having trouble maintaining any kind of gains all the way back during the Napoleonic Wars. Is that Britain has this massive empire, but if it ain't beating on people that, have sticks and stones and very basic flintlock muskets, while they have bolt-action rifles, dealing with another imperial power has proven to be far more of a tall order than they can actually deal with. And the only times that Britain ever seems to do well is whenever they have allies that will basically do their fighting and they're dying for them. Whether it's during the Napoleonic Wars, with the Russians largely doing most of the work against Napoleon, whether it is the Crimean War, which takes the British, the French, and the Ottomans all together to oppose and slow down Russian interests, and then eventually get to World War I, where Britain and France together are being comparable to Germany, and Germany is still fighting an entire another front against the Russians. Now, of course, you'll also have the British in other theaters, such as the major combatants against the Ottomans, in which Britain will do the vast majority of the work, but the Ottomans are not exactly something that you want to use your empire as a litmus test against. The old sick man of Europe is not exactly a victory, or defeating the old sick man of Europe is not exactly a stunning, achieving victory. And so, Britain's not weak. I don't want to put it as that, but it is being eclipsed by factors from around it. Economically, the Americans are way bigger, even with the entire British Empire at this point. The Russians are building themselves up into a modern nation state, which will be eclipsing them in the 30s. And the problem largely is that the only people that can actually prosecute a war are British citizens from the islands themselves, and everyone else within the empire largely is either used. Basically, the loyalists are used to police the empire itself. We talked about a lot of this during the Cold War episode. Is that Britain's kind of just suffering from overextension? Is basically what this means. Is that they do not have a cohesive geopolitical core that they can use to go around punching at certain people, unless you're just talking about the British Isles themselves. And when you're talking about a nation that both France and Germany and everyone else in the Great Powers list at this point is technically more powerful than the home islands themselves, you are pretty much at the end of your rope. And so this is what we'll see going into World War II, is that Britain can put up a fight. It's not weak, but it's largely the entire empire all together can only rival one of the other major powers. And so Britain's largely to the point where it's about to cash in its checks. Next is the Russians. We've largely talked about them, but basically Russia is going through a complete political, economic, and military transformation under Stalin's 5-year plans. It will go from being pretty much the 8th biggest economic power in the world come 1921-22, largely because it was recovering from a civil war, or, the civil war ends about 1921, even though there's some fighting that lasts into 23. Russia's trying to put itself back on the map. And granted, it was never a major geopolitical entity in the regards that it was never a major economic power before this. But all of a sudden, the Soviets start reaching out and basically intellectually thieving everyone's ideas. And they will rapidly adopt industrial techniques to build out the second biggest industrial economic plant in the world. There's actually some pretty good... We're not 100% sure on where the data lies, but the Russians in 1925 are 7th, 8th in the world economically. In the great powers, literally they're putting up the same level of numbers as Italy, and this is a country that has 3 times the population. Come 1940, before they're invaded, they're second. They've made a fundamental and massive transformation. And so, at least going in post-World War I, is that the Russian Empire is one of the 4 empires that is basically defeated, and they are defeated outright by Germany, largely by themselves, and a combination of the Ottomans, the Austrians. But at least in a nutshell, is that post-World War I, the Russian Empire is dissolved. You have a whole new state under the Bolsheviks that comes to power, and they will fundamentally transform Russia during the interwar years. And you can talk about the famines. You can talk about the political corruption and all that. The Russians pull off one of the biggest economic miracles in all of human history. I do not want to dissuade from that. And of course, you have the last one. You have the Americans. Americans are the only ones that kind of come out in any kind of good situation after World War I as well. And that's largely because everyone else does the dying and the fighting for them. The Americans will set out most of the war, selling everybody guns, selling everybody weapons and munitions and resources to prosecute the war, while the Americans just kind of sit back and watch everybody die. By the time the Americans are actually in the field, it's the last year of the war. And so you will have major battles where the Americans participate, such as Belleau Wood. But what really happens here is that Germany is on its last leg, and basically the Americans showing up in 1918 is the coup de grace that is used to finally put Germany into submission, while the Allies are able together to finally finish off the Ottomans, which is largely a British endeavor. And of course, the combined forces of the Italians are able to, and the Italians and the French are able to keep the Austrians at bay. And a lot of this is actually all done through Greece. I'm underselling the British. The British actually have a lot about winning World War I, particularly in helping out the Greeks and eventually in Serbia and whatnot. Is that the last year of the war, Britain really shows its strength, but a lot of that is actually done through the propagation of American influence and power into their economic systems and their structures, so that the British can largely retract from France, let the Americans take their spot, while the British can reassert their individual war efforts into extremities of the Central Powers. And this is largely what we'll see with Lawrence of Arabia, what we'll see in Iraq, and we'll also see this in Greece, is that the British are actually able to use, the British are basically able to go out in World War One and go, okay, cool. We're able to fundamentally hit the underpinnings of the Central Powers, and that will largely cause the Ottomans and the Austrians to collapse come the end of 1918. So yeah, well, largely, anyway, back to the United States to finish this off, is the United States actually comes out of World War One in a better state than what it had entered, and that's because it really doesn't have to give up anything. It will cost about 270,000 lives. It's no joke, but it's nothing compared to what everybody else was. Basically, the Americans get a bloody nose, and a reason to write a bunch of military spending checks to where they develop modern military doctrine, and they develop modern military weapons up to that point, particularly in the Navy. And all this really does, and this is really fucking morbid, is that what we see World War I do is that it prepares the American officer corps, both in the Navy and the Army, and eventually what will be the Air Force, to be prepared for World War II. Sucks, but that's what it is. Okay, cool. So, that's all the prelude, and we're already 41 minutes in. So, let's get into the gritty details here. When does World War II start? Well, no one really knows, because it's a big topic of debate. I'm going to start with the major conflict events that really kicks off, and I'm going to hit this off really quick. Japan is largely the first instigator here. They will be the first to lead the League of Nations, and they'll pretty much give the entire world community the middle finger. The reason why is that it's very, very clear to the Japanese that no one in the West wants to stop them, particularly when they openly launch hostilities proper against China. The first part is that Japan rolls into the province of Manchuria, which is about... I've talked about this a long time. Check out the Chinese video if you guys want to do that. China the Next Superpower is what it's called. Check out that. I talk a bit about Manchuria in there and the whole different regions that you have in China. But it's one of the major extremities within the Chinese sphere. It's not part of the Chinese core itself, but Japan just largely rolls through and occupies the region and sets up a puppet government led by Henry Puyi, which was officially the last emperor of China, but he was like 6 years old at the time. When he's made a puppet, he is a young man, and he really actually believes at first that the Japanese are there to help reinstate his throne. He quickly finds out that is a bunch of nonsense. He's a figurehead. Okay. So anyway, 1931, Japan largely rolls into Manchuria and basically starts setting up colonial projects within there. Nothing really happens for the most part outside of preliminary rounds. The German officer corps is actually in Russia doing tank training because they're not allowed to do that within Germany itself. You have the rise of the fascists in the 20s in Italy, but that doesn't. Outside of that, there's no major things that the Italians are actually doing preparing for war. It's in Germany that everything really starts taking off. In 1932, Paul von Hindenburg is made president of Germany, and he is old and he is decrepit, and at the same time, the Nazis are the biggest power in the Reichstag. However, Paul is one of these guys who is trying to stave off all the bad things from happening. He realizes that Hitler's a threat. He realizes that a lot of these people, if they're not kind of put in their place, will become a problem. And as long as he is alive, he is able to do that. He's a national war hero. And when he speaks, Germany listens. The problem with what happens is that in 1934, Paul von Hindenburg dies. In 1933, he makes Hitler chancellor. And the reason that he does this is that basically it's the whole proverb of keep your friends close and your enemies closer. It works. For what it is that it works. But the problem is that it allows Hitler to coalesce power in a way that when Hindenburg dies in 1934, is that it basically gives him, it largely gives him unrivaled power, is that no one else is actually there in Germany to stop him. And so, of course, not only after that, you have the whole Reichstag incident, which is very, very questionable, where the Reichstag catches fire, and Hitler is able to enact emergency powers and politically transform Germany into a totalitarian police state that reminds a lot of people of the Kaiserreich. And it's kind of weird because in some regards, it's incredibly popular. I'm not going to say that this is something that everyone liked by any measure, but this is not something that's alien to the German people. A lot of people remember the Kaiserreich. It was something that, had only happened 15 years before, or that it ended 15 years before. Autocracy is not something that the Germans find revolting. So, when they see Hitler come to power, they don't all get together and freak out, oh God, no, we've got a dictator and a despot. Political autonomy within Germany is only something that's not even a generation old at this point. So, what goes in is that Germany starts having massive economic, industrial, physical changes within its body politic. Hitler is able to root out basically all of his enemies with what eventually was the SA and then later the SS. And within 1936, he's largely consolidated all the power to where he is Führer, where he has the powers of the chancellorship and the presidency all in one, and he's dictator for life. The problem with what's going on is that the vast majority of people in Germany are happy with this because he's actually gotten Germany back on its feet. The economic numbers are quite staggering. Germany by 1936 is out of the Great Depression, even though it's already been hit. You have major public works projects that are convincing the German people that the government is not only capable, but absolutely competent in what it's doing. And this is stuff like the Autobahn. Of course, you'll also see, come 1935, 36, and 37, major military reforms that are basically to piss off on the Treaty of Versailles, where at first it's very tongue-in-cheek, hey, those are planes and they're German. But then eventually it becomes very masked off very, very quickly, where you have the Rhineland reoccupied by German forces, which was supposed to be demilitarized. You will have the rise of the Luftwaffe, which was supposed to be illegal. You will have the rise of a tank corps. And come 1937, Germany and Hitler is openly flaunting the Treaty of Versailles, saying, nah, go screw yourself. Germany is back on the world stage. And while this is something to definitely be concerned about within the international community, the German people largely like it. Now, a lot of people actually don't know what's going on behind the scenes as well, regarding Kristallnacht, regarding what's actually happening on the Jews, and whatnot. But the problem is that it's literally out of sight, out of mind. In a nutshell, is that what is going on in Germany is that for the most people in Germany, their lives are getting better, their confidence and their faith within the institutions is being restored, and they're able to be manipulated in a certain regard so that when somebody says, hey, Hitler is doing all these bad things, it's really hard for them to believe that when he has done so much good for their lives. And I hate to say this, and I'm not trying to defend this in any way, shape, or form, but this is how you get fascism, in a nutshell, is that you basically prove to be competent, and so you make the majority of the plurality's lives better, and you fuck over the specific people that you don't like. Communists, Jews, gypsies, that kind of thing. And you're able to do that. And that's what happens in Germany. Excuse me. Okay, so I want to stay there in 1937 because I'm going to go back to Japan. Because all the Allied powers are largely reacting, and they will all pretty much consistently react all the way into 1939. So, 1937, getting back to Japan, is that Japan has what's called the Marco Polo Bridge incident. And that is basically this bribed up little thing where it looks like the Chinese have actually had a military confrontation at the border of Manchuria and what is China. And to secure the national interests of Japan is that the Japanese engage in a full-on occupation or military invasion of the Chinese core. So the Sinaxi clique, the communist Chinese holdouts under Mao Zedong, the entirety of what is called nationalist China at this point under Chiang Kai-shek, and the Gaoxi clique, which is in southern China, is outright invaded by the Imperial Japanese military from both army and navy and air forces. and they are systematically wiped out. Now, granted, it will be a slow slog because while the Japanese are competent and they will literally beat the Chinese 3-1, the problem with Japan is that this is not a mechanized, fast-hitting, quickly moving militarized force. And China, while is on a completely different technological level, is able to import modern weapons such as airplanes and tanks and guns to oppose the Japanese. The Japanese will systematically wipe out 1/4 of the Chinese corps within a year, but after that point they're bogged down, and they will only take over half of the Chinese corps come the end of 1945, or come the end of the war, come 1945. The Chinese will only ever get 1 or 2 counterattacks, which will retake any major swaths of territory, and most of that is in 1944, and will actually be pushed back in 1945. So, at least in a major nutshell, 1937 kicks off. Japan invades in July from Manchuria and is systematically just beating the living dog shit out of China for the entirety of the war, and proving itself as a pretty competent military, at least against the Chinese. So, I don't really want to get too much into that because largely that's just one operation after another, and I'm not actually an expert in the Second Sino-Japanese War. So suffice it to say, millions and millions of men fighting at it, and the Japanese are just overwhelmingly competent in what's going on. Okay, cool. Let's go back to Europe. In Europe, things start going to hell in a handbasket pretty quickly. In 1938, the Nazis are able to coerce Austria, in March of 1938, the Nazis are able to coerce Austria into the Anschluss. What largely happens is that German political agents are able to basically make sympathy for making Greater Deutschland a reality, both in terms of nationalism, but also in terms of, support for the Nazi Party within Austria. And Austria is run by a very fascist-light person as it is, but the German political agents are largely able to effectively make the call for unification very, very strong. I can't remember what happens, but there's an incident in the second or third week of March that kind of kicks off events, and the next day the Germans effectively invade the country. And you have what is marketed to the world as the Anschluss, the union of the German peoples finally into one greater whole. And no one really protests. It was actually illegal under the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Trianon, but what really has happened here is that the Brits, the French, pretty much anybody who's anybody, kind of looks at it as like, well, this has been bound to happen since Austria became its own nation anyway. Particularly since the end of the Austrian Empire, so everyone doesn't really throw a fit at this because it was kind of just one of the kind of seen as a nationalistic, long time coming kind of thing, and so no one's really all that upset, and no one really throws a rug at it. What happens later is that come about August is that the Germans are openly saying, hey, look, we are the land of the Germans, but there are German peoples that are still not part of the greater Germany. And they start eyeing their neighbor, which is Czechoslovakia, which is now a major geopolitical threat because the majority of the Czechoslovakian border is a border with Germany, and it literally juts into the heart of Germany. And I wish I could show you guys on a map, but basically, it literally looks like a big old dick penetrating into Germany, and I hate to be that like crude, but unironically, like that is the euphemism I want to use here. Is that it's just this giant jutting, protruding thing into Germany, where if you were in Prague, you're within 120 miles in almost any direction. You're surrounded by German territory. It's only to the east that you're not. If you go west, Germany. Go north, Germany. Go south, Germany. And so at least in where we're at right now is that, literally Czechoslovakia is this big old dick just going into the side of Germany. And Germany's not really happy with that. Now, of course, they're not going to say that openly, and what they use is an excuse of ethnic Germans in an area called the Sudetenland, as an excuse to say, hey, look, we want the Sudetenland because it's full of Germans. You should give that to us. Well, there's a trick here. Number one is that the Sudetenland is the fortified areas that are bordering Germany and Czechoslovakia. And so if the Sudetenland actually becomes part of Germany, what largely would happen is that there is no place where the Czechs can actually sit down and defend. And masterstroke, what happens is that unironically, the Czechs aren't invited to the party. And you have the Germans, the Italians, the French, and the British get together, and you have the First Vienna Conference. And that is the fate of Czechoslovakia. And they talk about, all right, cool, we'll appease you, Hitler. You have a claim here to ethnic Germans. We acknowledge that. You have to agree that you will make no more territorial expansions. You will not do anything further. Hitler agrees to this, where he's basically handed the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia loses its entire defensive ability to defend from Germany. And the Czechs are largely sold out, even while having technically an alliance with the French. Is that the French basically back the British in this whole appeasement thing. And so going forward with this is, excuse me, I'm just looking at something. Anyway, I had to send a message there real quick. Excuse me. Going forward with this, what happens is that for a second, it's peace in our time. The whole, Neville Chamberlain coming back, he's got the signed piece of paper, and it looks like war has been averted. But 6 months later, there's an incident within the Czechoslovakia, and within 12 hours, Germany is able to literally just come in and occupy the rest of what is the modern day Czech Republic, and they basically go to Hungary and the Slovaks. And they say, hey, Slovakia, you guys want to be independent, right? You want to be independent, right? And they give Slovakia its independence. Hungary is given a corner piece of Czechoslovakia that is technically somewhat Hungarian, which is actually part of modern day Russia, part of modern day Ukraine. It's really weird. It's literally where the Slovaks, the Hungarians, and the Ukrainians all come together in this one little area. But the Hungarians are given control of that and are kind of bribed into being members of the Axis. This pisses off everybody, to say the least, particularly the British and particularly the French. And so they make open reservations to the people that they know are the next folks on the list, and that is Poland. And everyone knows Poland's up next. But what happens is that Germany openly claims that Bohemia, which is the area that's still left outside of the Sudetenland, is still open to being, or is basically been brought into the greater German whole because it used to be part of the Holy Roman Empire, and it's basically a return to history. They have a long-standing claim. Everyone pretty much tells them to piss off. And so what you have is the French and the British openly tell the Poles they will guarantee their independence. If Germany attacks them for any reason whatsoever, they will come to their aid and they will declare war on Germany. Hitler thinks this isn't going to happen. Thinks it's an absolute joke. But also he tries instigating a few events to show some kind of level of separation here. And so at least what happens in a nutshell is I need to finish I need to throw a message out here real quick. All right, so what largely happens in a nutshell is that the Poles are guaranteed their independence. The Germans are not convinced in any way, shape, or form that the Allies are actually going to come back for the Poles. And so there's a period of diplomatic incidents that kind of fire off where Germany openly goes, hey, look, we want the Danzig corridor. Okay, cool. You won't give us that. How about this? Give us a rail and a road corridor. It'll be 1 mile wide stretch of land through the corridor. You still have your access to the sea. We have our access into West Prussia. And the Poles openly reject it. They are not having any of it. And then you get to largely what happens is that the Germans claim there's a border skirmish and the Poles are outright invaded. No one believes that the border skirmish thing is real, and of course we come to find out later it was actually done by German special forces, where they literally shoot their own dudes to start a war. But hey, whatever. What is it? September 1st, 1939, Poland is invaded by the Third Reich, and it is the dawn of the Blitzkrieg. Come September 3rd and September 4th, and the reason why it's a period over about 36 hours is that the Allies, one by one, systematically declare war on Germany. France will declare war, Britain will declare war, and of course you have basically the client states of the Empire, of the British Empire, declare war as well, such as Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa will also declare war on Germany. The problem is that symbolically it looks like for the Poles there is going to be help. And technically French troops actually roll in to the German, they actually start rolling into Germany. But they only penetrate a mile and then they stop. And what largely happens here is that two things. Number one, the Germans have put all their eggs in one basket. They have a very, very limited force that is stuck on the French border to protect it. And they actually, looking at real numbers, they can't defend it. And, the French don't push it. But no one believes that the French just knows this. Meantime, the entire German army is rolling into Poland, and it is literally an all or nothing push to eliminate Poland as quickly and as efficiently as possible, and they will do so within 6 weeks. And so basically, the second week of October, it's over. Warsaw technically falls the 22nd of September. And of course, the third week of September, you also have the Soviets invading Poland at the same time as part of a secret clause in a treaty that was signed back in August with the Germans. And so the Soviets get involved. Of course, the Allies do not declare war on the Soviets because they can't fight the Germans and the Soviets at the same time, and they don't really see the Soviets as the main antagonists here. What they do, they see Germany as that the Soviets are just being opportunistic pricks, but it's not worth going to war with the Soviets at the same time. And they actually figure on sooner or later, now that the fact that the Germans and the Soviets are going to have a border, is that sooner the Soviets are going to get dragged on the Allied side. And ironically, they end up being right. Excuse me. Going forward, to finish out 1939, is that Japan's kicking ass within China. Germany has systematically wiped out Poland in 6 weeks and is redirecting its forces to eventually invade France. Of course, they're going to hit a few other nations on the way there, but hey, whatever. Italy invades Greece come the end of the year and absolutely gets its ass kicked. Or maybe it's next year. I apologize. I might have the wrong date. I think it's this year. I don't remember. I apologize. It's either in 39 or 38. But what does happen at the end of 39 is that the Soviets invade Finland. And this is this is the Winter War. And the Soviets, while not being, part of the Axis, is showing that they're making belligerent moves to themselves, and it makes everyone very watchful because it looks like the Germans and the Russians, which they had just signed a pact in August, might be allies. And that scares the hell out of everybody. And no one's sure quite what to do with that, especially when the Russians invade the Finns. What really puts everyone's mind at ease going into 1940 is that this is the major geopolitical struggle that's going on, and the Finns will lose, but they absolutely beat the Russians to death. They will bleed them white. It's ridiculous. It's like a 5-to-1 KD ratio. the Finns are just incredibly competent, and the Russians look like the biggest dumbasses on the planet. And there's a reason for that. Basically, if anyone doesn't know, two things happened. Number one is that back in 1937, Stalin killed 80% of the entire Soviet officer corps because he was scared shitless that they were going to pull a coup. And so anyone who was, what was it, all but like a handful of generals. So anyone who has 1 star on their shoulder, all the way up to field marshal, there's only, there's only like 3 or 4 of them left that isn't killed. Outside of that, something like 80% of the equivalent rank of colonel and 60% of the people that are equivalent rank of major are killed off, and you even get into some captains and lieutenants. He systematically wipes out the entire officer corps of the Russians. If you want to prosecute a war, the number one thing that you need is people who know what the fuck they're doing. And what happens is that Stalin, just a few years before World War II kicks off, kills anyone and everyone who knows what the fuck they're doing in a military. Because you can conscript people and train them to shoot a rifle. You can do that in, 3 months. That's not horribly hard. Giving people the expertise of doctrine, of understanding that whenever you're attacked here, you flank here, or you resist here, or you fall back, and when to, and how to, and basically, having the doctrinal effects of having an officer corps, or of an officer corps. I'm sorry, I cannot word today. Basically, at minimum, an officer corps takes 8 years to train. At minimum. And that's largely just getting them to the rank of major. Getting them into generals usually takes 15 years. And having a full trained officer corps from scratch to full cycle, that's 20 years. That is a project. And so basically what will happen is that this one effect, even though the Russians probably were never going to be that competent anyway, is that it makes the entire war, the Russians, even on the offensive, when they outnumber the Germans 3-1 in some cases, are still pulling 3-1 casualties, because literally the entire doctrine of the Soviet army is, forward, comrades! And it doesn't go very well. It doesn't go very well at all. So yeah, doesn't go well. And so Russia doesn't prove confident during the Winter War, and eventually when Barbarossa kicks off a year later, is that it will be even worse. So, 1940, going into 1940, is that, talked about Japan, I don't need to hit that, and I'm not going to talk about them until Pearl Harbor. In early 1940, and I believe this is in March, Germany sees that the British and the French are preparing to secure Norway by either bringing them onto the Allied side or actually invading them, because for 6 months out of the year, the major iron ore supplies coming out of Sweden has to go through a Norwegian port of Narvik. And this is a massive geopolitical threat to German security, because this is fueling their war machine. And so Germany just gets the drop on what is going to happen, and they invade Denmark and Norway in short order. It is a race to get into northern Norway to actually secure one side or the other. The Germans prove to be competent, even though they will lose basically half of their navy to do it. And so, without further ado, is that with a rapid response action invasion, or basically Denmark is wiped off the map in 6 hours, and after 2 weeks, Norway is effectively wiped out, is that the Germans occupy 2 more nations. Okay, holy crap. Here we go. May 10th, 1940, is Operation, what is it, Case Yellow? Operation Yellow? What happens is that Germany goes full on for nothing, right? They don't just invade France. They invade France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Holland all at the same time. And the reason that they do this is that basically, number one, is that France and the United Kingdom is expecting World War I over again, where the Germans are going to go through Belgium. And the reason why is that on the French-German border is they built a massive array of fortifications called the Maginot Line. And the Germans know they really can't punch through that without a long, grueling siege warfare. It's not really in their doctrine. It's not really in their strategy. Their plan is to outflank, the Allies, just like they were going to try to do in World War One. There's a difference here. Number one, tanks. The Allies are not really prepared for the new tank warfare that has largely come about. And while they have heard and understand that something is radically different and the ability for the Germans to move and engage in armed military conflict, they don't understand what Joseph Goebbels will call Blitzkrieg, but effectively is a combination of new military doctrines in how to exploit frontal air aviation, which is what we now call close air support, Schwerpunkt, which is basically an armored fist, and Kampfgruppe, which is basically battle fighting groups. What the Germans do is they coalesce this into what we now call Blitzkrieg, which is where you send very mobile, very hard-hitting, very fast action groups into very exploitable zones. You break open the enemy lines, you send mechanized and motorized units through the lines, and you wreak havoc all through the back, while the infantry body comes through the exploited through the exploited breaks in the lines, encircles your enemies by just being a little bit more mobile and being a lot more professional, puts them in a box, and literally just grinds them down to attrition. This is Blitzkrieg in a nutshell. And the way that this works is that the Germans are able to pretty much systematically destroy the Allied armies, even though if you look at the entire German army and the entire Allied army of Holland, Britain, France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, is that by numbers they're relatively comparable outside of the combined militaries of the Allies are a little bit bigger, but the German Air Force is almost twice the size. And their tank force is actually about the same size. But what the difference here is that the Germans have a doctrine, they know what they're doing. Two, they have a better Air Force in the regards of doing what they want to do with it. And most importantly is that the anti-tank doctrine is not what it needs to be for the Allies to counteract what the tanks are about to do. And so strategically, tactically they're able to completely work around the Allies. But strategically it gets even worse because the Germans go through an area that no one thought the Germans were going to go through. What they thought is that, particularly after Holland was invaded, that the Germans were going to sweep through southern Holland and northern Belgium into what was called the Deal Line, which was a river deal through Belgium. And they were going to sweep through, and then they were just going to go straight south into Paris. What the Germans do is they go through southern Belgium and northern Luxembourg through an area called the Ardennes. It's very hilly and it's very forested. A lot of people didn't even think you could roll the tanks through the area. Turns out they could. And the tanks back then weren't that nearly as big as the juggernauts that we have today. But what happens is that what happens is that the Germans snake through the Ardennes because the Allies are not even looking there. Their primary elite units are northeast by about 100 miles. And so by the time the Germans have actually gotten through and the Allies have figured out where the Germans are literally running through the Allied rear lines at 100 miles a day, just wreaking havoc on supply lines and lines of communications, to where the Allies are now forced into stunning and massive retreat to try to figure out a line of defense that they can actually propagate effective resistance. Because of how systematic this flanking maneuver is, and the Allies' ability not to be able to perpetrate into the flank of this flank, if you will, or basically a counter-flanking operation, is that without a place without a stable place to launch an effective counterattack, the Allies are forced to withdraw. And the problem is that the German forces and the panzer groups that are running through northern France and southern Belgium are so quick that they're actually beating the Allied forces to their withdrawal points. And it basically it largely is the end of the French military and the Allied militaries within Western Europe within 6 weeks. What basically happens, technically we'll put it this, it's actually 2 to 3 weeks, is that the Germans are able to complete this flanking operation where instead of actually going up and down into Paris, they go down and then up towards the English Channel, and they take the entirety of the elite forces of the Allies, and they put them in a corner called Dunkirk. And this is, you may have seen the movie, you may know some of your history here. The vast majority of the entire British forces are evacuated. The French largely stay for what they can to hold off, to give the British a fighting chance, but everyone leaves their equipment there at Dunkirk. And of course, a lot of it was old anyway and didn't work all that well. But the Germans completely, tactically and strategically outfox the Allies to that what should have been an even fight is over in 3 weeks. And over the next 3 weeks, that you will see the complete dismantling of France, which is largely a foregone conclusion after the surrender at Dunkirk. Because everything that's left in the French army and everything that's left within the Allied armies is basically reserve units that are not properly trained, properly equipped, or able to sustain major combat operations. And so come June 10th, you have an armistice, and France surrenders. Now, granted, there's a lot of details here, but here's the long history short. France signs the armistice and is effectively out of the war. However, not everyone goes along, and you have a split. There is a new puppet government that is sympathetic to the Nazis, established in a city called Vichy in southern France. The entirety of northern France is given over to the Germans for occupation, and that is anything with the bordering the Atlantic coast. The Germans will now occupy as part of their war to. It will be part of their war to propagate against the British. Okay. Southern France is basically left over as a colonial administration for handling the French colonies. The problem with this is that not everyone agrees that France should have surrendered. A lot of the people that were not on France or in French soil have a big thing that they have to deal with, where they either carry on the fight as what will eventually be known as the Forces of Free France, and of course you will eventually have the leader of this emerge as Charles de Gaulle, or you will become a sympathizer to the Vichy regime and basically become part of the Vichy French government. There's significant splits within the French colonies. Some will side with Free France, some will side with Vichy France, and things go to hell because there is a bunch of weird stuff that happens regarding how the French Navy is supposed to surrender, and how all this is supposed to fall out. And I'm just skipping over a lot. I apologize. There's so many details I could talk about just the surrender of this that I could spend the better part of the next 20 minutes here. What happens, though, in a nutshell, is that the British are not happy with what happens regarding the surrender of France, and if the French Navy and the German Navy is combined, it is a serious threat to the British. So anything that doesn't openly surrender to the or any French ship that doesn't openly surrender to the British, straight out of the gate, is openly seen as a hostile threat. And you had the massacre at Mers al-Kabir, where the British basically go against one of the major fleets that is still left in the French, or basically goes against one of the major French fleets that's still docked at anchor, and they'll shell them while they're there. And you will have a significant amount of the French people die, and I can't remember the statistics, but it is still something that is remembered to this very day that stains the relations between Britain and France. Is that while they are allies and they still largely get along, is that this is something the French are still to this day pissed about, because the French were going to surrender, but they were never going to hand over their navy. And part of the terms of the treaty is that Germany was never going to be able to take part, or was never going to be able to take their navy. And the Vichy French government openly said that in the event that the Germans tried to take their navy, is that they would actually side with the Free French, and they would be subjugated to basically rejoining the Allies in the fight. Basically, the Brits fuck it up. But anyway, long story short, hindsight's 20/20, and bad things happen. So, finishing out 1940 is that Britain. This is the year that Britain stands alone. You will have the Blitz on London, where At first, the German Air Force, the German Air Force largely goes about trying to bomb British cities and British airfields and trying to knock Britain out of the war via basically preparing for a ground invasion. The problem is that, number one, they are not able to knock out the British Air Force. They got really close, but then all of a sudden they started bombing cities. This was because there was a British bombing raid that went awry and it bombed Berlin, and Hitler was pissed. Ironically, an accident that saved Britain's war effort, because while London and major cities across Britain would be bombed to shit, is that their airfields and their ability to prosecute the war no longer was the primary target, and so the RAF is able to stay in the fight. And this actually saves Britain. Now, there's a whole other question here. The Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion of Britain, never happens. And the reason, number one, is that the RAF isn't defeated. But even if it was, there's a massive question about the British Navy opposing the landing, because they absolutely could have. Now, the balance of power is this. Learning what we learned from the invasion of Norway is that the British tried to come into the straits between Denmark and Norway to stop the invasions and cut off German forces. But what we learned is that Germans have the air superiority there, as they were able to bomb the living crap out of anything that came, or any British vessels that came within the area. And so there is a big conversation that if Germany did secure air superiority and largely defeat the RAF, would they have been also able to take the entirety of the British Navy and to basically keep it within arm's reach so that they could prosecute an invasion of the British Isles? And the answer is probably a little bit of both yes and no. The British would have thrown everything in the kitchen sink at opposing an invasion of the British home islands, because that was a no-go. On the other side of that is that had the entire Royal Navy actually have been a major target within the English Channel, is that the German Air Force would have been able, in its full volition, to make that a target, and they would have sunk most of the Navy. And so, would have Germany have succeeded? No one's sure about that. A lot of people will say yes, absolutely. A lot of people say no. I think the answer is actually a lot more of a draw. Is that if Germany was able to participate in Operation Sea Lion, it would have been an absolutely bloody affair for both sides, with horrendous levels of casualties and a lot of death and destruction. Looking at what happens with Crete, the airborne forces would have been largely expended in the operation, and the entirety of the German Navy would have been pushed to the absolute brink and probably sunk as well. There's a lot of questions that will always be unanswered, but for those who like to do your what if history, knocking Britain out of the war would have been a formal push for Germany in 1940, and probably wasn't really feasible until late 41 or early 42. And of course, that gets into Barbarossa and all that, where that's canceled. So, going into the end of 1940, is that Europe is largely dominated by the Axis. There's very few people there's no Allied powers left on the continent. Anybody else is either a neutral power or is kissing the boot of Germany, outside of course, the Soviet Union. The Soviets will take over the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia within short order. They basically just kind of walk in and say, hey, this is ours now. And they'll also demand Bessarabia from Romania, which is now modern-day Moldova. And it's very unfortunate, because Moldova should be part of Romania, but hey, whatever. I know I'm forgetting something, and I don't know what it is, but okay, we're just going to call it 1940 a crash. 1941 happens. Okay, cool. Early 1941 is the Germans switch tactics. They are openly now preparing for the invasion of the Soviet Union, which was going to happen in May. But what happens is two things. Number one, I apologize. 1940 is when Italy invades Greece, and they fuck it up horribly. And so two things have happened. One, Greece is not being subdued by the Italians, which is becoming a pain in the ass for the Germans. Not super serious, but the problem is that with Greece being formally in the Allies, is that the Allies now can launch bomber missions out of Greece to Polesti, which is the major oil major oil production area in Romania that supplies most of the Axis troops with their fuel and oil needs. And so that is an existential threat that Germany has to respond to. Also, almost at the exact same time that they start preparing for commence operations against Greece, Yugoslavia, which originally had signed on as being part of the Balkan Alliance as part of the Axis, has a coup and openly says that they are more interested in joining the Allies at that point. Germany says to hell with that. And so all the other Balkan nations, along with Germany, so Germany, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria will invade Yugoslavia and Greece and wipe it out in the period of about 6 weeks yet again. 6 weeks. It's always 6 weeks. Anyway, this will largely happen within April and May, but it pushes back the timetable for the invasion of the Soviet Union and probably saves the Soviets, to be honest. So, anyway, all the forces go down in early April early April, and they won't really finish combat operations up until the second week of May. At that point, everything starts heading back up north and preparing for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Germans are going to put anything and everything that they have against the Soviet Union, and basically the rationale is this. A lot of people talk about whether this was the right thing to do, whether it was the wrong thing to do. Strategically, it makes sense. The Soviet Union has proved that it is not competent by getting its ass kicked by the Finns, and what they do realize is that Germany realizes that only with more time, the Soviet Union becomes a bigger and bigger threat, because they know the purge has happened, but they're going to eventually have new officers that are going to fill the ranks that have an idea what they're doing. They're going to have newer military equipment on top of what they already have, which is the biggest standing army in the world. And so, better to hit Russia now than later. And they're largely right in this. The problem is twofold. Number one, the invasion's a little bit later, and the timetable gets screwed up. Number two is that during the invasion, everything goes to crap. And it's not necessarily that it doesn't go to plan as much as the plan changes. So, June 22nd, 1941, the biggest invasion in all of human history happens, where Germany openly invades the Soviet Union. Within 2 weeks, they're already over 100 miles into the Soviet Union, and that's pretty quick. Most compared to what we've seen throughout history, that is something that never happens unless you're literally just walking in unopposed. But they'll largely be to they'll actually be 200 to 300 miles in some cases. They'll get to the gates of Smolensk and Kiev within 2 weeks, and that's quite far into the Soviet borders. What largely happens is every week that goes on, the advance gets slower, and that is because Soviet resistance gets a little bit better and a little bit fiercer with each passing mile and each passing day, but also the German lines of communication. The German lines of communication are being extended for each and every mile that they go. So it takes longer to get replacement parts, longer to get fuel, longer all that. You are fairly attractive. I don't know if that is completely out of the context of this conversation, but I thank you. I have to stop for that. All right, cool. And thank you for that. Anyway, going into this in 1941, and we're at an hour and 30 minutes, so I'm going to try to wrap up the war as quickly as possible. We'll probably hit about 2 hours. Germany is having trouble, and they'll actually bring in fellow Axis forces to help secure the line as they trade attrition. Most of the invasions that they have done, they will not lose more than 100,000 men between all of them combined. When it comes to the invasion of the Soviet Union, by the end of 1941, the Germans will have taken 1 million casualties fighting the Soviets. Now, of course, the Soviets will take in something like 8 million casualties, so literally a 1-8 ratio. But as a general overall thing of what's going on here is that I'm still laughing at that comment. I apologize. Anyway, what's going on here is that the Germans are not victorious, but they're also neck deep into the Soviet Union. And in fact, the last weeks of November, they get to the outskirts of Moscow. What happens is that the day that they're about to make their final push, and it's either the last weeks of November or the first week of December, is that it gets to negative 40 below, and everything freezes up. People, tanks, machinery, nothing works. But the Soviets don't have this problem because all their stuff is geared to live in Russia. And so the Russians launch the first counterattack against Germany. And they push them back like 80 miles in this counterattack. It's not substantial in the greater context of things, but it's a massive PR disaster. Because what really happens here is that the Russians have shown that the Germans are not invincible and they can make mistakes. And so the German army, more in a morale sense, doesn't collapse, but it significantly loses a lot of its morale, with a lot of people still in their summer uniforms and they're freezing their ass off in the depths of Russia while actually getting their butts kicked for the first time. And the Soviets have shown, hey, we can do this. Of course, you'll get into 1942, and that is a massive seesaw, but we're not there yet. 1941 is where Japan comes alive in its second round, and this is kind of referred to as the Asian Blitzkrieg. December 7th, 1941, is that Japan has openly figured out months before that they cannot exist in a world with the United States. And it's really weird because basically is this. Japan wants to join Germany in fighting the Allies. They think that's a good idea. They're not going to invade the Soviets because they got their ass kicked 2 years before at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, where the Soviets have proven that with tanks and airplanes and all this other modern stuff that Japan has but not as much of, they're not a contender for the Soviets. So what they do think is that while France is distracted and basically being occupied, and more particularly while Britain is fully distracted within Europe, and more importantly, and most importantly, the Netherlands being occupied, is that they are able to basically stroll into Southeast Asia. They're able to roll into Southeast Asia largely unopposed, and what they need is largely the rubber and the oil that comes out of Malaysia and Indonesia. They need that to run their war machine. The reason that they need that is that they're not able to get the rubber supplies from Malaysia, being basically sympathetic to Germany, but also most of the synthetic rubber that will be developed during the war is not really online yet, and so almost everybody's rubber comes from this area outside of what is technologically being revolutionized during the war. At the same time is that the United States in early 1941 puts an embargo on Japan because of the invasion of China, and they're largely saying, look, we're done helping you. We don't care. We like making money, but it's not worth this. You are beating China's ass. We have openly called for ceasefires. We've openly called to arbitrate. We're trying to maintain some kind of balance of power here. You're not playing ball. So here's an embargo. Between Indonesia and Japan is a series of islands called the Philippines. And the Philippines have been an American client state for the better part of 40 years at this point, since the Spanish-American War. Japan does not feel confident or secure taking Indonesia and Malaysia and Hong Kong without taking the Philippines that's in the way, because it's not the Philippines that they worry about, it's that the American Navy is every bit as sizable and as large as the British Navy. In a knockdown, drag-out fight, the American Navy will probably beat the IJN, the Imperial Japanese Navy. And so, basically, what the Japanese figure out, stupid enough as it sounds, is that two things. One, they can handle all the other allied powers because they're busy in Europe. True. Two, if they put all of their eggs in one basket and go for a knockout blow, they can wipe the American Navy out because it's split between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Pretty true as well. The problem is that they think that if they can do this, they will force the Americans into peace negotiations because they will have given them such a bloody nose that the Americans will be like, whoa, we don't want this. And largely this is out of racism. In the same way that Westerners don't think the Japanese are actually a competent military power that is capable of much, and the war will be over by Christmas, the Japanese feel the same way about Westerners, actually, where even though they have been technologically prowess and kicked the living shit out of China during the Opium Wars, and Matthew Perry going into Japan 100, 70 years before. What Japan has largely convinced themselves of is that Westerners aren't really truly willing to fight a war, particularly the Americans. And the reason why is that the Americans are always like the last to show up to the party. They don't actually want to fight. They like making money. While Japan has proven over and over again that they're actually willing to bleed and die in a fight for the glory of the emperor to win their geopolitical objectives. And so basically, Japan highly overestimates itself in its ability to prosecute a war, and it drastically underestimates the Americans that if done a proper damaging blow, the Americans will basically just throw a white flag. Pearl Harbor happens as the surprise attack to knock out the American fleet. And they knock out pretty much the entirety of the Pacific Fleet in all of its capital ships and quite a bit of its auxiliaries. The thing that it missed is the carriers. Everyone talks about this. What really comes down here is this. The era of the battleship was already coming to an end, and what actually bases this out is that in 1940 you had the raid on Toronto, where the British actually bomb a major naval port in Italy, and they actually do critical damage to 2 Italian capital ships, which are battleships. The aircraft carriers are all coming, and the problem is that all the carriers in the Pacific are on exercises when Pearl Harbor happens. And so basically, Yamato figures this out. A lot of the Imperial Japanese staff do not. Is that all they do for the Americans is that they get rid of all of the old doctrine based around battleships because they don't have any battleships to fight with, and they fast forward and fast track what was already becoming the American response under aircraft carriers. And so while they have functionally taken out a large part of America's combat capability in the Pacific, the most important part of the Americans' combat capability, which being the aircraft carriers, are still secure. And so the Americans are able to regroup, put together a carrier task force, and they basically, all of the Pacific forces that they have will be built around the carriers and basically holding off the Japanese. They're outnumbered, they're outgunned, but the most critical assets that they need to have, they still do. And that's important. And this will get into, of course, the battles of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway is in 1942. Okay, 1941, just to finish it out, we talked about Germany, and Germany is neck deep in Russia, at the gates of Moscow, getting its nose beaten in. But on the same side, Japan is doing the Asian Blitzkrieg, that between December 7th, 1941, and basically May of 1942, they are on the Blitzkrieg. They will occupy Hong Kong, they will occupy the Philippines, Malaysia is occupied, half of Burma is occupied, and you will get into pretty much all of Indonesia being occupied except for a few enclaves here and there. And Japan will pretty much triple the size of its empire by sea and land mass very, very quickly within the span of 6 months. The problem for Japan, and we're just going to skip into 1942, is that Japan gets hard blocked in its final invasion of Port Moresby. Okay, let's put this in perspective. The last parts of Indonesia that hasn't been occupied is a place that is owned by the Australians, which we now call Papua New Guinea. All but like a couple islands in the Indonesian archipelago have been occupied, and it's the island of New Guinea, which is one of the biggest ones, and it's the big one all the way out the east. About 60% of the island's occupied, but it's divided by a giant mountain range called the Bismarck Range, and you have to take a naval invasion to get all the way around. This leads to the Battle of the Coral Sea, because once they have Port Moresby, they can go and invade Australia directly. The Japanese have already bombed northern Australia, come to literally to start. But anyway, yes, you're absolutely correct, Dan. This is literally the worst places to fight ever. Tall-ass mountains and jungles. Anyway, what happens is the Americans get wind of what's going on, because everyone can figure this out, and they send 2 carriers to take on the Japanese invasion force there, and you have the Battle of the Coral Sea. It is technically a draw, but strategically it's kind of a victory for the Americans. The Americans will lose one carrier, and that is, I believe, the USS Saratoga. The Japanese will lose one carrier, but they'll effectively lose the entire air wing of another. And so the Japanese will largely come off worse for wear. Also, because they have lost air support, they do not commit to the invasion at Port Moresby to finish off the Indonesian archipelago, and they start regrouping their forces to primarily go after the Americans and expanding their influence towards Hawaii instead of going after Australia, because Australia really isn't the threat, it's the Americans. And they're absolutely right on that. This goes into a couple months later where they're going to commit the entirety of the vast majority of the IJN at an island called Midway. And this is in June of 1942. The Americans and the Japanese pretty much put all of their Pacific assets into one basket for basically a knockdown, drag-out fight to see who wins. The Japanese know that the Americans are going to have some kind of response. They have an island air base. They have the carriers. They don't know how many exactly are going to show up, but it's pretty much just the American carriers and their supporting vessels versus the entirety of the IJN, battleships and everything. They have a couple plans to do this, but this battle is wholesale lopsided. It's either 4 Japanese carriers or 6 Japanese carriers, and I can't remember. I think what it is that 6 are technically operational for the fight, but or available for the fight, but 2 of them can't really participate in it. One because they've just been deplaned at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the other one is not available for some reason. I think they're up in the Aleutian Islands. I apologize, can't remember exact. 4v3 carrier battle. The entire IJN battleship fleet is there. Everything is there. But anyway, what happens is it is a completely what looks like a one-sided entity. The entire American fleet in the Pacific is there, and it's 3 carriers and a bunch of cruisers and destroyers and a couple of submarines. The Americans, through sheer miraculousness and kind of just dumb luck, pull it off. They sink 4 Japanese carriers, along with a cruiser and destroyer. The battleships aren't really important here. They're just basically floating anti-aircraft barriers at this point, or shore bombardment doctrine, shore bombardment assets. And they're not able to prosecute a shore bombardment because they basically, once the carriers are sunk, the invasion fleet is a massive target for the entire American air and naval forces. And so what you get into is that what happened, basically in a nutshell, what happens in this battle that completely screws it all up. Japan launches its first strike against the island of Midway to stop the American Air Force, or eventually the Army Air Force, eventually it will be the Air Force, from launching attacks against the carriers and using the island as a scouting operation. Largely succeeds. But they put ground attack high explosive bombs on. They are in process of launching a second wave when the Americans figure out where they are. And so the Japanese figure out, oh wait, we have to go for anti-ship combat now. And so they start reloading and refueling all their planes to go after the American carrier group. Just as they're largely finishing up, the American carrier groups, their aircraft show up on the scene. The first wave is a bunch of torpedo bombers that are antiquated and ill-equipped. They're largely shot down. And what largely happens is that between the anti-aircraft fire and the Japanese naval air forces, is that they're able to come together and destroy this attack group. And we salute the brave sailors that die in this incursion. But what it does is that most of the Japanese fighters are now out of ammunition and low on fuel, and so they go to land. At the same time, the strike package is finally just refueling and rearming to go after the American carriers. And it's the perfect scenario. Everyone's reloading, everyone's regrouping, and they're not able to defend the next wave, which is the American strike package of dive bombers. And the dive bombers are basically able to come in on these carriers, and what usually would take a number of bombs and torpedoes to blow these things straight to hell only takes 1 or 2. because it's loaded full of fuel, ammunition, and it just becomes a floating tinderbox. 3 carriers are wiped out in the span of 15 minutes. Or actually, I think it's even 5. And it's just basically kind of pure dumb luck, but the Americans carry the day in destroying 3 Japanese carriers. Just like that. Anyway, with that, the Japanese try to launch a counterattack with the remaining carrier that they have. They are able to do that. And so, the Japanese are able to launch a carrier attack, and they finish off USS Yorktown. Of course, but the Japanese think that they've actually sunk the entire American carrier fleet because they drop bombs on 2 ships, but they don't realize they've actually just bombed Yorktown twice. Anyway, the Americans are able to regroup with the 2 remaining carriers and sink the last remaining active carrier in the theater, and Yamamoto orders a withdrawal. In Europe, at the same time, is Germany goes on the offensive again in Russia. But kind of, this is where I actually give Hitler some really stupid points. His whole thing is that he is focused on in Germany's economics. They don't have a lot of food left coming in because a lot of their food and a lot of their oil and a lot of their raw materials that were coming in were actually coming in from the Soviets before the war. And without that, they're no longer gaining a lot of the materials that they need to prosecute the war. And so Hitler wants to invade, finish off the Ukrainian area, and then also go into southern Russia to capture their oil reserves in the Baku region of what is now Azerbaijan. It's a bridge too far. Instead of going for the knockout blow on Moscow, which the Soviets are largely prepared for, even though it would have been a knockdown, drag-out fight, is that the Germans probably would have won that. They would have been able to capture Moscow. They probably would have been able to capture Leningrad, and then systematically destroy the Soviet Union by basically cutting the head off the snake. Because all roads lead to Moscow. All rail lines lead to Moscow. And taking Moscow, even though you can move the government, you can't move the centers of infrastructure and communication that are there in Moscow. And this is, for me, this is the real screw-up that the Germans did if they ever wanted to win the war against the Russians, is that instead of going for Operation Typhoon 2 in early 41, they Operation Case Blue, which is the invasion of southern Ukraine, the rest of Ukraine and southern Russia. And the problem is that you will have a German front line that stretches all the way from Leningrad in the very north all the way down to almost Astrakhan in the very south. And this is a huge line. This is like 4,000 miles of front line. The Germans can't hold this. And what eventually happens is that the Soviets, through numbers, are able to start puncturing in at certain parts where the Germans can't hold the line. And what really tends to happen is they force the issue where Germany has to dump almost its entire army into one area to oppose the Russians. And this is a place called Stalingrad. Of course, a lot of people know what Stalingrad is. It's kind of like the ultimate reversal. What largely happens is that about 1/2 of the entire German army is eventually deployed to Stalingrad that isn't deployed elsewhere. And so largely they're focused in on one area. And the Russians are able to use that to kind of pin them down into one spot, and eventually they prepare a massive counterattack, which is Operation Uranus. That in late 42, after grinding the Germans down and losing ground bit by bit by bit, where Stalingrad is basically just nothing but a city of rubble, is that the Russians are prepared to launch their first counterattack, or the second counterattack. And it is the biggest one they've had yet. And it's during the winter when they have the advantage, where their machinery still works, where the Germans are having trouble. And so they will encircle the city of Stalingrad, and they will wipe out an entire army of 250,000 German troops in early 1943. And this is the Battle of Stalingrad. The Germans are sent literally one day racing towards Baku. All of a sudden, they're getting a phone call from their generals to be being told to turn around because their lines are no longer tenable. Basically, everyone's trying to fight to get back to Stalingrad and punch through a hole through Soviet lines. But between the winter and exhaustion and basically being stretched to the limit, the Germans are not able to effectively make a counterattack. And they will not be on the defensive but they will be on equal footing with the Russians or losing for the rest of the war. And so, finishing out 1942 in Europe is that the Battle of Stalingrad is going into its third phase. Italy is... I'm sorry, not much is going on outside of Italy or outside of Europe. Operation Torch at the end of 1942 is that the Americans go into their first European fray, and it's actually into North Africa along with the British, and they start helping push the Vichy France and the Germans out of northern Africa. The Americans will largely start getting their face beat in, but this is the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and most importantly, what's going on here is that this doesn't really start until 1943. 43 is the big year for everyone and everywhere. But to finish out 42 is that the entirety of the Pacific is now focused on a little island that is off the coast of Papua New Guinea at the end of the Gilbert... Is it the Gilbert Islands? I believe it's the Gilbert Islands. It's called Guadalcanal. And basically what has largely happened is after the Battle of Midway is that the Americans have put everything of stock into the battle, and they've really done a massive number to the forces of Japan. But the problem here, in a nutshell, what's really going on is that the Americans are exhausted, the Japanese are exhausted, and they will focus all of their efforts for the better part of the next year into one place. That's Guadalcanal. Okay, cool. Let's go to 43. 43 is at start. We'll go back to Europe. 43 in the winter and spring is in North Africa. Is the Allies will get the better of. I'm sorry. At the end of 42, the British win the Battle of El Alamein and start pushing the Germans back out of Egypt. At the same time, you have Operation Torch, and then in early 43, the Allies congregate around Tunisia and eventually push the Axis out of North Africa by the end of March, if I remember correctly. And so, at least where we are there is, excuse me, I can't talk. At least where we largely are there is, North Africa is no longer an active theater. Come early part of 43. The Battle of Stalingrad formally ends at the end of February with the surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad under Friedrich Paulus, and they are forced all the way back to Kharkov. What eventually happens is that the Germans are forced about 400 miles back from Stalingrad to a place called Kharkov. The Germans lose it. They make a counterattack. They retake it. And the line is largely built out around a place called Kharkov and a place called Kursk. And we'll get into the summer of that. But let's go back to the Pacific. The end of 42 and the early 43 is basically a trading slog match between the IJN and the USN over the island of Guadalcanal. Eventually, or what largely happens is the end of 41 is that the United States 1st Marine Division is sent in to invade the island, and they will start taking over it. Eventually, you'll take over a Japanese Air Force, a Japanese airfield, which will be rebranded Henderson Field, and the Americans slowly start pushing back. However, the naval battle around the island, and as silly as this sounds, is that literally it's just a knockdown, trade-out fight where at first the Americans start getting an upper hand, then the Japanese will get an upper hand, and this is over this period of months where basically what kind of happens is, and I can't put this into words the way I want to, is that no one is able to prosecute the decisive finishing blow on the other for quite a long while, because the Japanese Navy will beat the American cruisers as an example, but then they'll get countered by battleships, and the American battleships will show up and they'll get countered by Japanese battleships. And if anyone gets too close to the island, somebody's Air Force shows up and just bombs somebody to hell. And so I appreciate the comments in chat. But anyway, finishing all this out is that there is massive naval battles, such as, there's massive naval battles going on within the area of Guadalcanal, and this is like the Battle of Salvo Island. This is the Battle of the Slot, and you'll have major military assets lost here. USS Hornet will be torpedoed by a submarine, and literally the Americans get to a point where they have only one carrier, USS Enterprise, for the better part of 6 months. And it's literally Enterprise versus Japan. That's pretty much the American war effort. You have Japan, who is trying to do what it can, but most of its carrier forces are no longer in the fight because they have been deplaned and destroyed. And so they're trying to rebuild from that, even though they technically have carriers. They don't have people to fly. And so it's largely up to the battleship fleet. What America has largely done is that they've been able to send in most of their newer battleships, the ones that weren't destroyed in Pearl Harbor, to kind of counteract. Hey, person in chat, that's technically a TOS. I have to delete that comment. Do not do that again, please. I'm going to give you like a warning there. Jap is a slur. Saying for context. Can't say that. Anyway. Going forward, and especially when you say that you hate them, that's not going to go well. Anyway, going further is to put things into context. Excuse me. The Americans are able to send in their brand new battleships. It's okay. Understand. Sometimes bad things happen. I didn't take it as you knew or didn't know. Anyway, the Americans are able to send in some of their new battleships, and they're able to engage the Japanese battleships in one-on-one fights. And it's one of the few good battleship actions that you actually have during World War II. And largely, you can look into this. This is USS Washington just absolutely showing the crap out of one of the Fuso-class battleships. I can't remember which one. Sherm's not here anymore. But the Americans show that these new North Carolina-class battleships, and not Iowas, the Iowas aren't deployed yet, but USS Washington is able to basically just shell the living crap out of the IJN in the middle of the night with radar-assisted shells at point-blank range because the IJN doesn't know it's there, and absolutely bodies one of the biggest battleships that the IJN can put up. And this actually helped put the Americans on a higher footing because without the carriers and without the air support actually able to finish the job, this is where the Americans start winning the Battle of Guadalcanal, is that they will make losses and gains here and there, but it's the American battleship presence that allows them to start pushing the envelope against the Japanese cruisers and the Japanese destroyers, as the IJN is not willing to commit its own major battleships into the region. I don't know why that is. I would really need to talk specifically to Sherm about this, but the loss of major cruisers and some of the older battleships in the IJN really puts a level of concern into the Imperial officer corps. And I think the reason why, and I'm guessing here, is that their carriers are no longer operational for most of 43. And when they start losing battleships to American battleships, it looks like the Americans are proving to be competent. And so they start playing a lot more reserved, and they start playing a lot more defensively. And of course, in midway through 1943, the Americans assassinate Admiral Yamamoto in basically an ambush mission using aircraft. And so, anyway, long story short, come mid-1943, the Americans really start getting the upper hand, and this is where all the new American assets and toys start coming online. USS Essex enters the theater, and so it's no longer the USS Enterprise alone. The Americans have new stuff to play with come June and July of 1943, where the first brand new carrier that was designed, like before and during the war, is now in commission on the runway, or I'm sorry, not on the runway, but in the sea, and it's got new planes, and it's got new toys, and the Americans are going to show what they've got. And this is getting ready for the ultimate confrontation navally in World War II, which is the Battle of the Philippine Sea. We'll get there here before too long. But basically what's happening is that in 43, the Americans are able to go on the offensive in a major area because the American industrial plant, it can build destroyers and cruisers pretty quickly, but carriers and battleships take a while. But they start rolling out in 43, and they start rolling out very quickly. By the end of 1943, the Pacific will have 4 American carriers in it, if not 6. I can't remember the exact numbers, but starting the year off with 1, they'll have 4 to 6 by the end of the year. And that's massive. And so going into it, basically the Pacific in 1943, to finish off, is the Americans slowly building out an advantage and starting the island hopping campaign towards Japan itself. I'm not going to talk much about any of that outside of the saying that 3 things happen. Number 1, Guadalcanal is finally won about midway through 1943. The major military bases at Rabaul and Truk for the IJN are bombed and basically eventually destroyed in come late 43. And early in 44 is that we get up to the ultimate naval clash between the IJN and the Americans that will determine who's going to win the war. And this will be the Battle of the Philippine Sea outside of Guam. So when we get to 44, we'll definitely talk about that. Rolling back to 43 in Europe, where you talked about the Allies taking out North Africa. That's been a thing, and the Soviets have defeated the Germans in Stalingrad. 2 events happened relatively at the same time. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, happens in quarter 2 of 43, and they're able to propagate into Sicily and largely overrun the island within short order. And this is largely Patton and Montgomery doing this. That's not too much of a threat. The Italians and the Germans aren't really worried about that. It was largely an untenable situation for them anyway. And the Eastern Front against the Russians is that everyone's preparing for their own final clash, or if you will, they're preparing for their own ultimate clash, and this will eventually be the Battle of Kursk. This will be the biggest tank battle and pretty much one of the biggest battles that all of history has ever seen. As an individual battle, where if you're talking about just the theater operations within 100 square miles of what is going on, this is the biggest battle in human history. Is that the Soviets will send every bit of 1,500 tanks versus the Germans' 1,000 tanks into this area in a knockdown, drag-out fight to see who's basically going to win the war, because it's largely implied that the Germans know if they don't win this, if they can't push the Soviets back and regain the losses that they've had, they're pretty much done. The Soviets know that this is the first time that they're going to be able to equal the Germans in a knockdown, drag-out fight. And so largely what they realize is that we can beat them in the winter, let's see if we can beat them in the summer. The Germans wholesale miscalculate. What the Germans are largely doing is that for the better part of quarter 2, they're preparing. They could have launched all the way in late April and early May and launched Operation Citadel, and they probably would have won. But what they do is that 2 things. 1, they know they've got new toys coming off the block. This is the Panther and the Tiger tank. Basically the development is procured. The development is delayed. And so they wait later and later and later before these new assets are deployed in the field. Number 1, turns out they don't work. Tiger's okay, it's not terrible, but there's only about 60 of them that are actually able to deploy. And the problem is that even with all this waiting, they don't have very many of them. There's about 300 Panther tanks that are deployed to Kursk. And these are, brand new medium tanks, and they're not bad yet. The problem is that basically of the 287 that are sent to Kursk, 87 have completely destroyed themselves getting into the fight. And the most of them are not, or will be within their repair shops within 2 weeks of the launching of the operations in June. What largely is Germany's fuck up here is that Germans wait for new technology and allows the Russians to prepare static lines of defenses deeper and deeper into their own territory, so that once you cross one line, you just got another line of resistance. And the Russians can use their numbers and their material superiority to their advantage and just grind the Germans down. to butter. Had Germany just went with the technology and the weapons they had at the end of April or early May, where the Soviets were not prepared and the Soviets were still amassing their forces, Germany probably could have won the Battle of Kursk. And I don't know if they would have won the war because of that. I think it was probably too late. But they would have done such significant damage to the Russian army in its entirety that by the end of 43, both armies would have been exhausted, and 1944 would have been largely a recoup. What instead happens is that the Russians are able to bleed the Germans white. Militarily, as far as equipment and in manpower, to where Germany will be exclusively on the defensive for the rest of the war, and the Russians are actually able to launch a secondary offensive in late 1943 that will push the Germans almost completely out of Ukraine entirely. This does not count the northern parts. This will actually go into 1944, but the Russians have so much steam left over after Kursk that when they launch their final and full counterattack, is that they will body the army or Germany's army group south to the degree that they're pushed all the way back to their starting line back in 1941. Yay. Good God. And so 1943 is largely Operation Citadel in Europe, going to hell, and the Russian counterattack that completely wipes Germany out of Ukraine, and basically the Russians and the Germans taking stock there. The Germans are also going to deploy come week 3 of Operation Citadel, because in second week of July, if I remember correctly, the Allies invade southern Italy, and this panics the Germans and the Italians, because the Italians openly start talking about surrendering, and the Germans know that the Italians cannot hold off the Allies alone. And so they actually have to start taking forces away from the operations in Russia just to help shore up those defenses. And that's pretty much the end of Operation Citadel and the Battle of Kursk. And so, counterattack, all things happen, and you get into later 43, like operations in Anzio, and where you get down to the 8th month battle of Monte Cassino. That starts. Okay, cool. We're in 1944 at 2 hours and 6 minutes. God, I didn't think this was going to be that long, but hey, hurrah. All right, we're going to start wrapping this up because 44 is the big year for everything to happen. 43 is huge, 42 is huge, but 44 is basically the year that decides that the Allies are going to win, and it's just a mopping up operation after since. Okay, let's go back to the Pacific and Japan. What largely is happening here is the Americans and the Japanese have largely been preparing with the new American Navy that's being built fresh off the factory floor versus the entirety of what Japan can muster, old and new, and this is the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Now, this won't happen till the middle of the year, but everything is just led up to them prepared for this. I do not think that the IJN actually miscalculates here. I don't think they necessarily do anything relatively wrong. The problem is that the IJN is completely and absolutely outclassed top to bottom. Most of the Japanese naval air forces are new recruits. They don't have many veterans left over because most of them were killed during the battles of Coral Sea and Midway, and they've never been able to replace them. And they don't have veterans they can take off the lot to train up the new guys. And so, while it's not necessarily an even fight, it's like a 3-2 odds in favor of the Americans. The Americans have a massive skill advantage, and so it's like 11 carriers to 6. Or no, I'm sorry. I don't think it's that. It's like 11 carriers to 8, if I remember correctly. It's literally everything in the kitchen sink from both sides is deployed into this battle. And the Americans call this the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The entirety of the Japanese naval and air forces, not just naval air forces, but also their ground air forces that are deployed to the Pacific Theater, are subsequently shot down. Something on the order of 630 planes in the period of a week are shot down by the Americans, and the Americans only lose like 40 altogether. It is one of the most one-sided battles in all of human history. From then on, the Japanese are firmly on the defensive. They cannot prosecute any kind of major offensive operation. They'll try one more, or they will try one more, and this will be the Battle of Leyte Gulf. I can't remember exactly what the overall operation is, but this is in late 44. And what they do is that they realize that they can't win with their aircraft carriers, and so they sacrifice their carriers in late 44 as sacrificial lambs to distract the American forces at Leyte, so that they will leave their invasion force undefended, and only old battleships will be there to defend it. And they will send everything in the battleship fleet through the Philippine Islands up to Leyte Gulf to fight the Americans in a gun duel. Problem one: the Americans have escort carriers. They're not very effective, and they're not really geared out for engaging in fleet actions. But they have high explosive bombs that can harass the the Americans are largely... I have no idea who that is. Anyway, the Americans will put up just a knockdown, drag-out fight against the IJN, and the IJN gets spooked. With two massive ships, they get spooked, and eventually what happens is that as the IJN comes to regroup to make a second push, because they finally realize that they actually have the superior numbers and firepower, is the American main task force under Bill Halsey has finished sinking the destructionary aircraft force, and the next day they're able to regroup and actually attack the Japanese battleship fleets, and they will sink the IJN Musashi, which is Yamato's sister ship, and they will formally completely destroy all offensive capabilities that Japan can commit to for the rest of the war. The Japan will not really have anything outside of suicidal bonsai charges for the rest of the war against the Americans. And so that largely wraps up 44 in the Pacific, and I know that it's vague. Like, we can talk about the invasion of the Philippines, and particularly in 45. I'm going to rapid fire that just to get through that all. Let's get back into Europe. Europe, southern Italy is occupied by the Allies. There is a line in southern Italy that is fixated around a monastery that has been turned into a fortress by the Germans and the Italians, but particularly the Germans, called Monte Cassino. And with this one key point is that the Germans are able to hold off the entirety of the Allies all at one point, because they have artillery and spotting throughout most of southern Italy that they can direct fire and defensive operations to where the Allies can't go anywhere further. This is largely the operations that Anzio that is tried to use to get a flank around that. And of course, what largely happens is this. Anzio is in a complete disaster because the Allied Navy is able to use cruiser guns to use as gun support, so that the Germans cannot get close enough to wipe them off the beaches. But anytime that they get out of range of the cruiser fire, is that the Germans are able to absolutely manhandle the invasion forces. And so Anzio becomes a disaster along with Monte Cassino. Is this before or after Italy switches sides? This is actually about the same time. What eventually happens is that at the same time, the Italians are having secret negotiations with the Allies to flip sides. They will technically surrender during this time, and the Germans will take up the defense of Italy in full stead. What largely happens, though, is that Italy is supposed to switch sides, but it doesn't really do that. It just kind of just checks out because they aren't able to propagate a war anyway. Eventually, you will have the rise of the Italian Social Republic, where Germany is able to put Benito Mussolini back into power in northern Italy as the Italian Social Republic. But basically what this is that it's Italy 2.0, and it's a client state, and it's largely just there as a figurehead, and it has no real power. The Germans are in charge, and they basically are occupying northern and central Italy. Eventually, the Americans the Americans and the British figure out how to get around Monte Cassino after months and months of trying. And you're not wrong. Anyway, after months and months of trying, the Americans are able to take Monte Cassino, and they are able to start rolling up at Italy. What happens is the day before D-Day, June 6, 1944, is that June 5th, General Clark gets into Rome, right? And so to give you timetables here, the reason why the Central Italian campaign, once they finally break through Cassino, is forgotten largely to history and because of the press, is that literally the day before Rome is taken, or the day that Rome is taken, the day after D-Day happens, and that is in June of 44. Just to kind of give you guys some background into D-Day, is that they knew they were going to eventually invade France, and they were going to go through northern France and go into Germany and basically liberate Western Europe. A lot of people didn't know exactly where. Some people thought it was going to be... Most people thought it was going to be the Pas de Calais, which is a really short stint across from the Straits of Dover. But you also have Normandy, and a lot of people thought... there was a few people even thought they would go into Brittany, which wouldn't have been a horrible idea, but there were some logistics issues. Anyway, make a long story short, after months of preparation, particularly the better part of 6 to 7 months, the Allies fully commit to the invasion of mainland Europe, and that is D-Day. Of course, everyone talks about D-Day. You all probably know about that. I'm not going to get too much into that, or what's going on there. D-Day has basically the Allies get in to secure a foothold, but they're stuck in the area of the Bocage, and for the better part of 2 months, they're in a slogging fest with the Germans, not getting anywhere. In Italy, what has largely happened is they get up now 2/3 up the way of Italy, and they get into what is called the I can't remember what it is. I want to say the Mannerheim line, but I don't think that's quite the right word. But anyway, what largely has happened is that the Germans have made another defensive line that rivals the line in Monte Cassino, and this will not largely be broken until early of 45. And so Italy is largely out of the war from this point, outside of some skirmishes, until literally it's like March or April of 45. Central Italy occupied during 44 as a large degree, and then it's kind of just forgotten about. What happens in the Eastern Front is what we call Operation Bagration or Bagration. No one's quite sure how to pronounce that. I believe that the technical term in Russian is Bagration. But anyway, what happens is that Germany has been defeated, or Army Group South has been defeated and pushed out of Ukraine and is now in southern Poland and northern Romania. What you have, though, is this giant jut in the northern part of Russia and Belarus and the Baltic states, where the Germans are still there. And this is Army Group Center and Army Group North. North is largely consolidated in Army Group Center, and the Soviets plan for the better part of 44 to launch a full summer offensive into Army Group Center to actively destroy it. The guy who's kind of in charge of this is a guy named General Rokossovsky. Kind of makes his claim to fame here. After months of preparation, literally like trucking in stuff at night to make sure the Germans are not aware, the Russians launch the biggest offensive operation that they will during the war, and they will absolutely destroy in the entirety, all of Germany's Army Group Center, and they will push them all completely out of Belarus and into Poland when this is all said and done. This will be the better part of the second half of 1944. The first half is literally just the preparations for this, because the Soviets are exhausted come the end of 1943. But they will rebuild, they will re-equip, and they will send the entirety of the Soviet juggernaut at the best of what it still remains of the German armies within the Soviet Union at the time, and decisively defeat them. When it is all said and done, coming into 1945, Russian forces are entering German territory itself, which is West Prussia, Eastern Prussia, around the area of Kaliningrad, or it used to be Königsberg. Pretty much going into 1945, the original borders of where the war started in 1941 have been reassessed for the Russians. 45 will just be a mad sweep into Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe. And so we've covered 44. Moving into 45, this is pretty much moving back into 44. I apologize. What largely happens after D-Day, two months of a long slog, and then the Americans get Operation Cobra together, where they figure out how to outflank and push a hole hard into German forces. And so It won't be until late August, but eventually they will break out of the beachhead that they have had in Normandy. And between at the end of August and going all the way up into November, France will be categorically liberated. Most of Belgium will be liberated, and they get into southern Holland. Of course, a lot of people know that there is a stint where this slows down, where what happens is about once they get to an area called Metz in France, which is most of France has been reoccupied or has been liberated or reoccupied, whatever words you want to use. In southern Belgium is that the Allies are tired. Their lines of communication are too far. Like getting supplies and fuel to the tanks is getting too hard, and so they have to stop. And what happens is that there's a big conversation in the Allied lines about how to pursue the war further. And you have two major theories. One is to have a broad general advance that is a little bit slower, keeping the lines of supply going, but keeping the Germans off kilter where they can't regroup and reassess. The other is Bernard Montgomery's plan, which is Operation Market Garden. And this is the first time the Allies really have a trouble going out in a proper offense. What the whole plan is that literally it's the reverse Schlieffen plan, where the Allies want to go up through Belgium, up into Holland, and then jut over into the rural valley. I can't say that correctly. Ruhr is how it's spelled in German. But they want to go into that area, and that is the primary industrial area, and they want to end the war by Christmas by making this giant flanking maneuver into the core of Germany over the Rhine River. What largely happens is that, one, the Allies don't take enough time to prepare. Number two, their intelligence is wrong, and they run into the most crack divisions that are regrouping and reassessing of the German army within the Western Theater. And it's a bloodbath. And this is the whole Bridge Too Far movie and a whole bunch of other things where basically, it just doesn't go very well for the Allies at all. And so ending 44 is that basically the border of Germany with the Allies is actually the Rhine River, as they've been able to push up all the way to wherever the Rhine is. And the Germans are preparing for a counterattack. Going into, actually this will start in December, is we know this in the West as the Battle of the Bulge. And this is the first time the Allies since 1940 will be subjected to a German offensive. And just to show how competent the Germans are, is that the Germans will kick the shit out of the Allies for the better part of 2 weeks. There's a lot of talk about what they did wrong and what they did right. I'm not going to get into that. What largely happens is the Germans largely run out of fuel, and the weather that was keeping the Allied air forces out of the skies finally comes to an end, and they're able to bring air and artillery and basically the entire Allied suite that isn't naval to bear against the Germans in the better part of the first weeks of January of 1945. And anyway, Battle of the Bulge happens where the Germans go on the offensive. They were never going to win the Battle of the Bulge, but what they did is they shown that they're still competent and a serious threat, and it scares the living hell out of Allied leadership, so they'll take the Germans seriously all the way up until the last days. We move into 1945, and finishing out the first weeks of January is basically retaking the areas that were lost under the Battle of the Bulge and redressing themselves, because a lot of people kind of think at the end of 44, even though they've kind of failed with Operation Market Garden, the war's basically over, and 45 is going to be the knockout blow. They're right, but they've come to realize that the Germans are not going to surrender and they're not going to give up. And so they've got a big thing. I'll finish Europe first because it's easier and it ends quicker. In spring and winter of 44, the Allies are basically regrouping after the Battle of the Bulge, but the Russians are going on an offensive where they will basically get into into central Hungary, and they'll get into Pomerania and basically retake all of Poland, more or less. And then you also have the invasions of Romania and the Balkan states, which will actively flip sides and become occupied by the Soviets. In the spring you had the final offensives into Germany. in Italy. Italy finally is broken in April of 45, so that pretty much the entire country is occupied come the end of VE Day. You have the Allied offensives crossing the Rhine in early spring into the British are in the north. You have the Americans and the French, the Americans largely in the center, and in the south you have the French and the Americans pushing in on a broad front after they've collected enough fuel and resources and supplies to propagate a massive push, and they'll systematically walk through that region and take down the Germans writ large, where they'll get actually into the Czech Republic when the war comes to an end. On the Soviet side, you have the operation to take up Berlin, and this is the crowning achievement for the Russians. There is that they'll throw like 2 million men into this battle. It's kind of ridiculous. They'll absolutely get bodied, but you'll have the end of Hungary, you'll have the end of Germany itself, and then you have victory in Europe, May 8th, 1945. And so Germany surrenders. There's a few areas that will still be largely occupied by the Germans come VE Day. Northern Germany is still technically controlled by the German military. You'll have Denmark and Norway, which was never liberated, but they'll largely be forced to surrender and come home. And you have the start of the post-war atrocities that we talked about during the Cold War. Moving over into Japan and the Pacific is that you have the end of the Philippines in early of 45. I think it's all wrapped up by April. You have the Battle of Iwo Jima. You have the Battle of particularly Okinawa, which is the largest naval invasion in all of human history. There's like 6,000 ships that participate in that operation. It's ridiculous. And what largely happens is come the end of July, the Americans are preparing for the final operation to invade Japan, which will be known as Operation Downfall. Operation estimates are, okay, if anyone's wondering, the reason I'm skipping over the Battle of Manila, the Battle of Iwo Jima, and the Battle of Okinawa is that it's basically a one-sided slugfest. It's largely just Japanese are entrenched and healed, and they're not willing to give up any ground, and they're slowly just rooted out with tanks and bombs and flamethrowers and artillery and all kinds of crap, and it's just a prolonged extermination of Japanese soldiers. Getting into July, or the end of July, is that once Okinawa is over, is that they're having the preliminary estimates of Operation Downfall. It will be 2 operations. The first will take place in November of 1945, which is Operation Coronet. That will be the invasion of the southernmost Japanese island, and I gotta remember, it's Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. The island of Kyushu, they will invade the southern part in November of 45. This doesn't happen, by the way. This is what they're planning for. And then in early 1946, in March, I believe, is they will have Operation Olympic, which will be a direct invasion of Tokyo Bay. The estimates and the war theory, the war gaming, is horrific. Assuming the casualties that are provided from Iwo Jima and Okinawa is that estimated Allied casualties will be in the factor of 1 million. It will be the bloodiest battle in all of human history. And what the Allies don't even know is that not only is the entire Imperial Japanese army preparing to make the last stand on the Japanese home islands, they are going to sacrifice their own citizenry to do it. They are arming school children as young as 13 with bamboo spears and telling them they are training them to charge into the American landing beaches and front lines into machine gun fire to stave off the invaders. The civilian casualties were estimated to be somewhere between 3 and 5 million. In reality, it would have been 10 million because the Japanese were going to basically commit mass suicide in the event of trying to stop the Americans and the Allies from landing. What is also becoming incredibly bad is that the war in Europe had ended in May, and what it's come to realize is that the Soviets are not going to honor any agreement that they have regarding Japan, and so they're trying to get Japan. They were trying to get Japan in, but all of a sudden they realized that they don't want. They were trying to get the Soviets in against the war against Japan, and and they realize that they don't want that, because the Soviets, while being a massive help, would absolutely not play ball with anything that the post-war world that the Allies wanted. And they had been shown that, particularly when it comes to the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. And so the Cold War is already starting to start up before the war even ends. What happens is that after leading the original points, and no, I'm not a historian. I study in economics and political science, but I have to know my history to understand the context. Anyway, to finish all this off, at literally like 2 hours and 30 minutes, is that Truman is made aware of something called the atomic bomb. And he realizes that the cost of an American invasion of Japan is not going to be pretty, and they must do anything and everything that they can to systematically wipe out Japan as a functional entity if they're actually going to invade. And so they test the nuclear weapons on two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it completely levels two cities with one bomb and one bomber. Unfortunately, this is the only two. The Americans at this point had only made 3 nuclear bombs. The first one was tested at the Trinity test site. The second one was Little Boy, which was dropped in Hiroshima, and the third one was Nagasaki. They probably would not have had another bomb ready until 46, from what I am aware. But they were going to revise the plans for the invasion to use the nuclear weapons. And it's a good thing they didn't do this, because no one knew about radiation poisoning at this point, to a large degree. It wasn't understood. And so what largely happens here is that August 6, 1945, is that you have the first atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Give me just a second here. I want to make one thing very clear. Thank you for all the follows. I appreciate that. And I probably should have been shouting that out during the whole thing, but I just try not to do that. Okay. August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. It levels the place solid. 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, is dropped on Nagasaki, and it levels that city to the ground. At the exact same time, or actually that morning, or early in that morning, the Soviets commit to the Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation, which is the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, which is northern China, and they will basically enter the war against Japan. What largely happens as a result of this is that Japan, between the bombs and the Soviets entering the war, know they can't win. There is no negotiation. They will have to formally surrender. And it is basically, there is a meeting. Some people don't know if it's rigged or not. There's questions up to this day, but what largely is implied is that they leave the emperor to decide, and the emperor decides for that Japan, regardless of what cost, will unconditionally surrender, and that surrender is signed. That surrender is signed on September 1st, 1945, VJ Day, and the end of World War II is committed. I absolutely disagree with this. J-Lo's 59. The Soviets were planning on invading Japan for months. That was not something that they actively just decided that they were going to do because of the bombs. They promised that they were going to invade 90 days after the surrender of Germany, and they do it on day 90, literally to the day. Not going to say that I don't want to dissent for the Soviets in any regard, but they were absolutely going to do this hell or high water. We've gotten into a lot of the fallout when it comes to what happens post-World War II and the Cold War, but largely is that go check out that episode, because this is already 2.5 hours, and I don't want to add any more than it is, but I largely do a full recap on what happens post-World War II and setting up the Cold War in the first 30 minutes of that episode, so definitely go check that out on my YouTube channel if you haven't seen that particular stream. If it's not available right now, it's because it will release next Monday. If you're watching this on the live stream, if you're watching this on YouTube, obviously it's already out because it was recorded after. And I apologize. But anyway, to wrap this all up is that the world of empires is dead. There is only 2 geopolitical entities that are left to propagate themselves in a world after World War II, and that is the United States and the Soviet Union, and the world is divided into two armed camps. The Cold War has begun. I've been Tyberius D for Geopolitics with Tyberius D. This has been the biggest episode we ever did. I can't believe we blew past the Cold War episode, which is, we did, oh my God, we did like 8 years, and in longer time than we did 40 years. But anyway, Q&A real quick if you guys want to do that. Were there other allies that were going to take part in the invasion of mainland Japan, or was it only going to be U.S.? The British were actually redeploying forces from Europe to help. The Australians and the Kiwis were also going to take part in operations to invade. To invade Japan. I thank you for the 200 bits. That's the first time we've actually had that on record. It's usually a subs, but yes, thank you, Fedor or is it Fedor Mephitis? I can't say that correctly, but yeah. The Allies were gonna have a full invasion come 1945, 1946, and it was largely gonna be the Americans, the British, and the Australians and the Kiwis, and a few other people would show up eventually. But what premeditated that was the Soviet invasion, and the Soviets were on track to invade Hokkaido in early 1946 had they been able to, but thankfully they were not able to. I will answer all these questions here in just a second. What is your stance on the use of nuclear bombs towards the end? Probably the right thing to do. Some people call it unethical, some people call it whatever. If I was Truman, I absolutely would have done it, and I would have slept soundly that night doing so. I don't think Japan would have. I don't think 100% Japan would have surrendered without the use of the bomb. But I do also believe that the bomb wasn't the only measure. I think the Soviets invading too was what kind of kicked everything over. Is that a cat or a dog? I only see the tail. Yeah, cool. We can have a small little thing here. We have two doggies. The first one is here, taking a nap. He is not dead, I promise. Jack, I love you, buddy. It's good to see you. He's just very tired. He's been sleeping all day. And then we got the other dog, which is hanging out there. Give me a second here. We'll try to get you sorted out there. That is Buck. Hello, Buck. I think Buck wants to go outside. He does want to go outside. Hi, buddy. There you go. But anyway, yes, we have two beagles, and they are good friends of the community and the channel, and they are fan favorites. At the point of a proposed Ally invasion, were the Japanese troops only in Japan or in China, or were they still in surrounding countries? Unsure whether they were pushed out by those at this point. Okay, to answer this question... Oh, hell, crap. Okay. They were in China. They were in Japan. If you count Manchuria as its own thing, they were still there. They were still in Taiwan, which was called Formosa, which is technically considered part of China at the time. So you can count that. And they had been bypassed in some areas throughout Indonesia. They were definitely in Malaysia. They were definitely in some parts of Indonesia that had been skipped over. They were largely pushed out of Burma at this point, but Japanese forces were in Thailand, French Indochina, such as Vietnam, and Laos and Cambodia. So there was plenty of places where the Japanese Empire were still there. Definitely. But as a general whole, in the same way that Germany had places still that had yet to be liberated, Japan officially surrendered because the war could not be continued. And it was only a matter of time before they would be systematically destroyed. So yeah. I would agree with the use. I don't know if I would sleep soundly, though. I wouldn't question it. But yeah, sure, I get you. Fator Mephitis. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Cute dogs. And yeah. So, without further ado, I have been Tiberius D. We are cracking 2 hours and 40 minutes with this episode. And you know what? I'm too tired to even continue doing an AMA at this point. So if you want to think, if you got a really good snarky thing you think you can distract me with, I'd say go for it now while I do my intros. But if you want to contact me, you can contact me at Tiberius D on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and you can do a little bit on some other social media too. Leave comments down below on, always feel free to chat in Twitch. Leave comments down below if you're watching this on YouTube, and watch out, look out for my Instagram if you want to see wonderful storm clouds or the promos for all the stuff that we're doing. You can do that too. We are closing in on 1,600 followers here on Twitch, and if you guys would really help me out on subscribing into YouTube, that'd be appreciated, because this show is critically fucking underrated. And I'd like to actually, have it comparable with people like Caspian Report and a few other folks, but whatever. Anyway, to close this out, definitely could check out my other content. You can find all of that here on Twitch, or you can find that out on YouTube. That is the Mask Off podcast and the Mask Off, which is where we talk politics with individuals, or get together on panels and we talk about things and where people are coming from and all the wonderful jazz there. If you think my break brain takes in geopolitics are good, or my history, you should definitely check out my nerd rants and all the things that I do on Reviews with Tyberius D, where I review movies and television shows and video games and talk about how good they are, why I like them, why I don't like them, all that wonderful stuff. The newest channel that we're building out, still building up, but if you guys want to check out any of that content, definitely check it out here on Twitch or on YouTube. And of course, if you really, really like me, you can definitely... Oh, thank you, Osiris. I didn't know you were still here. Good to see you, buddy. I'll definitely give you a shout out here in a second. If you really, really like me, definitely give me a hand. There's 3 ways to do so. Number 1, you can send me a sub here on Twitch. That would be appreciated if you want to do that. You can donate to me by tipping to me through PayPal. That is largely goes through my Twitch, but it basically is just a fast track route through PayPal if you want to help me out there. And third is we now have a Patreon. Now, nobody has actually bit the bullet yet on the Patreon, and I'm waiting for my first candidate. I would love to see that. And so once we get that ball rolling, I know more people are going to follow suit. I'm just waiting for somebody to do that. If you want to just give me a little help, that'd be appreciated. I don't have any major rewards. And if you want something out of the Patreon, definitely let me know. I'm going to enable the Discord mod for that at some point. And I keep forgetting to do that to get in my private Discord. But yeah, minimum is $3 if you want to help me out really, or if you want to help me out more. And if you basically, the point of Patreon is that you're supposed to get rewards. If you want something out of it, we can negotiate that. I can 100% go with that. Help me build out the Patreon as a thing. But anyway, without further ado, I have been ranting and raving for way, way too long. I've been Tiberius D. For Geopolitics, Tiberius D. I hope you all have a wonderful night and a wonderful time with whatever you're doing, and catch you later.